The imperial palace of Valdoran has stood for 300 years, but no one who walked its marble corridors tonight believed it would survive until morning. 7 alpha kings, 1 poisoned cup, and a servant girl from a border province no one had ever heard of. Standing alone in the wreckage of an empire's certainty, holding a silver tray that suddenly weighed more than a throne. If you're watching from your city right now, drop its name in the comments, because this story was made for people who understand that the most dangerous moment in any kingdom's history is never the battle. It's the silence right before someone decides to light the fire. Stay with me. Like this video. And let's find out what happens when nobody is who they claim to be. The wine arrived at the preparation chamber 6 hours before the banquet, sealed in unmarked casks that smelled of dark plums and something sharper underneath. Something that cut through the sweetness the way a blade cuts through silk, clean and wrong at the same time. Alara noticed it. She noticed most things that other servants chose not to. She had been working the imperial palace for 11 days, assigned through the provincial labor registry as a temporary body to fill the gaps in the permanent staff during the summit preparations. 11 days was long enough to understand the rhythms of the inner corridors, long enough to learn which stewards checked their inventory lists and which ones signed papers without reading them, long enough to map the distance between the service entrance and the grand hall in steps she counted automatically without meaning to. It was not long enough to understand why the ceremonial wine had been resealed. She said nothing about it. That was the first rule of invisible service. You noticed, you cataloged, and you buried everything behind a blank expression that the powerful mistook for stupidity. Alara had been raised on that rule. Her mother had worked as a laundress in the Valdoran border garrison for 22 years and had taught her daughter everything she needed to survive inside systems that were not built for people like them. Notice everything, say nothing, become furniture. The preparation chamber was organized chaos in the 2 hours before the summit banquet commenced. Senior stewards barked at junior staff. Junior staff knocked into each other trying to look purposeful. 2 assistant masters of ceremony argued in a corner about the proper height of the floral arrangements on the high throne dais, voices sharp and eyes distracted, the way men argue when they are frightened of something larger than centerpiece flowers but cannot name it aloud. Alara carried platters. She refilled water pitchers. She stood where she was directed and moved when she was told, and at no point did anyone look at her face long enough to remember it. The 2 ceremonial goblets arrived on a velvet-lined tray carried by an imperial chamberlain named Austin, who was a tall man with the particular walk of someone who had learned early that his authority depended on everyone believing he possessed more of it than he actually did. The goblets were identical, hammered silver with the Ashbourne crest pressed into the base, filled to a precise level that Austin measured with a small copper rod before setting them down. The high goblet goes directly to the Emperor's right hand, Austin announced to no one specifically and everyone within range. The secondary goblet is placed for the guest of honor at the Emperor's left. No one touches either vessel once they are placed. No one. If I find a fingerprint on these cups that is not from a certified cupbearer, I will personally see the responsible party sent to the border garrison mines before the evening is finished. He said it the way powerful men say things when they need to fill a room with their own importance. No one responded. Responses invited attention. Alara was 4 feet away, organizing the secondary serving trays against the preparation counter, when the first argument broke out near the entrance. 2 house guards and a senior steward were blocking a nobleman's attendant who had apparently been sent to verify the seating arrangement for his lord's delegation. The argument was quick and loud, the kind of collision that happens in overcrowded spaces when everyone is operating at the edge of their composure. Bodies shifted. Someone's elbow caught the corner of Austin's velvet tray. Both goblets slid. Alara moved before she had decided to move. That was the only honest way to describe it later, in the moments when she would replay it in the dark hours of her holding cell. Her hands went out, and she caught both goblets before either hit the stone floor, 1 in each hand, wine sloshing to the rim but not spilling. She set them back on the tray. 2 seconds. The argument at the entrance continued for another 30. When it resolved and Austin turned back to his preparation, the goblets were where he had left them. His copper measuring rod checked the levels, found them acceptable, and he moved on. Alara did not realize what she had done until much later. She had set the right goblet in the left position and the left goblet in the right. What? The Grand Hall of Valdoran's imperial palace was built to make human beings feel small. That was its architectural purpose, not merely to impress, but to reduce. The ceiling vaulted 70 feet overhead in carved white stone that caught the light of 3,000 crystal torches and scattered it into something that was less illumination than revelation. Tapestries depicting 3 centuries of Ashbourne conquest covered the walls, each one larger than a common man's house, each one showing the dynasty's history in careful, commissioned colors that made slaughter look inevitable and clean. The 7 alpha houses filled the tiered seating that curved around the central aisle. Elara had spent 3 of her 11 days memorizing their house colors for service purposes, because the stewards had made clear that confusing a Thornwall delegate's cup with a Blackfen ambassador's was the kind of error that ended careers. House Thornwall, in silver gray, their lord a compact man named Varys, who sat with the stillness of someone conserving energy for moments that mattered. House Blackfen in deep green, their delegation larger than any other, their whispered conversations running like a current beneath the formal silence whenever the senior protocol officers turned their backs. House Edenmere in copper and white, their lord visibly nervous, fingers working the ring on his right hand in the way men do when they are aware of having made recent decisions they cannot undo. House Greymantle, House Caldress, House Ironfall, House Vecht, 7 kingdoms, 7 thrones. Every one of them had come to this summit with a specific list of what they needed from the Empire and a private list of what they were willing to destroy to get it. Elara knew none of their specific politics. She did not need to. She could read the architecture of the room. Where the guards were clustered too densely, which delegations had their heads angled slightly toward each other across the aisle, which lord had positioned himself where he could see every other lord without being seen from the Emperor's dais. She stood at her assigned position along the service wall with 8 other junior staff, the ceremonial wine tray in her hands, and she waited. The Emperor arrived without announcement. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected trumpets. She had expected the formal procession that the protocol officers had rehearsed twice in the 2 days prior. Instead, the doors at the far end of the Grand Hall simply opened, and Emperor Kaelin Ashbourne walked through them alone, without escort, wearing no crown, his only imperial marking a single black coat with the Ashbourne insignia pressed into its left shoulder in dark silver thread. He was 34 years old. She knew this from the service briefings. He had ruled for 9 years following his father's death, and had spent 7 of those 9 years at war with at least one of the houses currently seated in this room. He was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something large and declarative, the kind of man who moved through rooms the way weather moves, preceding himself, filling the space before he arrived. What she saw instead was someone who moved like he was measuring something. His eyes went across the assembled lords without pausing on any single face long enough to be read as scrutiny, and yet she had the distinct impression that he had seen everything in the first 4 seconds. He took the high throne without ceremony. "Sit," he said, to the assembled kings and lords and ambassadors. The way a man says it to people he is fairly confident will obey but is not performing certainty about. They sat. The summit began. Elara did not listen to the speeches. She watched the edges. That was something her mother had also taught her. When you are in a room where powerful people are performing for each other, the important things are never in the performance. They are in the margins. The attendant who leaves and comes back looking altered. The delegate who stops breathing naturally when a particular topic is raised. The man who is too still when stillness is not appropriate. Duke Varric of House Caldress was too still. She had him in her peripheral vision for most of the first hour. He was a large man, 50 perhaps, with the particular build of someone who had once been physically formidable and was now carrying that history in his frame the way old soldiers do. His house colors were midnight blue. He sat at the Emperor's left, which made him tonight's guest of honor, a rotating diplomatic acknowledgement that the protocol officers had explained in the service briefing as essentially meaningless in political terms. He was positioned directly in line with the secondary goblet on the ceremony tray she carried. When the formal toast was announced, Elara moved forward with the other cupbearers in the practice sequence they had rehearsed. She approached the dais from the left, as designated, and placed the secondary goblet in front of Duke Varric with both hands, as the protocol required, stepping back in the immediate 3-count withdrawal. She was back at the service wall when Varric raised the goblet. She was watching his face because she had been watching his face for an hour, and his stillness had not broken. It broke when he drank. His expression changed between one breath and the next. Not pain immediately, but something more frightening than pain. Recognition. His eyes went wide in the specific way that happens when a body understands something before the conscious mind has formed the thought, and then his hand dropped the goblet, and it rang against the marble floor like a bell, announcing something irreversible, and Duke Varric collapsed sideways out of his chair with a sound like a large tree going down in a windstorm. Blood came from somewhere. She could not see where exactly, but it reached the marble fast. The room detonated. She would spend a great deal of time afterward trying to find an honest word for what happened in the Grand Hall in the 30 seconds following Varric's fall. Chaos was too gentle. Chaos implied something random. This was not random. This was a system breaking at all its stress points simultaneously, the way structures fail when the calculation that held them together is suddenly and catastrophically wrong. Swords came out of scabbards. She heard it before she saw it, that specific metallic whisper multiplied by 100, filling the vaulted space like rainfall made of iron. Lords were standing, delegations were clustering. The Blackfen contingent had their lord behind 4 guards in under 4 seconds, which told her they had rehearsed that specific movement, which told her they had considered this possibility before arriving tonight. Imperial guards sealed the exits. 8 doors, 14 guards per door, appearing from positions that had not been visible during the banquet, emerging from behind tapestries and from servant corridors, moving with a precision that felt less like a response to emergency and more like a protocol that had been waiting for its activation. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. A lord she could not identify from her position was demanding answers from anyone within reach of his voice. Alara did not move. She stood at the service wall with the empty silver tray in her hands, and she breathed, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and she watched. The guards did not know what had happened. That was visible in the way they held their formation, controlled but scanning, looking for the threat that their training had prepared them for, but that the environment was not producing cleanly. An assassination in a closed room should have a visible vector, a blade, an archer, a specific attacker. What they had was a collapsed duke, and a room full of people all presenting simultaneously as potential suspects. 3 guard captains converged on the dais where Emperor Kalen still sat. He had not stood. That was the detail that cut through everything else for Alara. In a room of 300 people, every single one of whom was either moving or preparing to move, the Emperor of Valdoran sat in his high throne with his hands flat on the armrests and his eyes sweeping the room with that same measuring quality she had noticed when he entered. He was reading it, all of it, simultaneously. His gaze stopped on her. She did not look away. That was instinct, the same instinct that had moved her hands when the goblet slid, a refusal to perform the kind of smallness that invites the worst assumptions. Looking away from power in a moment like this was what guilty people did. She had not done anything wrong. She also had not yet understood what she had done. One of the guard captains leaned down to speak to the Emperor. Kalen listened for approximately 6 seconds, then lifted one hand in a gesture so small it should not have been readable across a room of 300 bodies in various states of panic. Every guard heard it, saw it, acted on it. The panic did not stop. It could not be stopped that quickly, but it redirected, like water finding new channels. And 8 guards were walking toward the service wall, toward the woman holding the empty silver tray. She carried the cup, someone was saying behind her. That's the cupbearer, the one who brought the secondary goblet to Keldris. She did not turn to find the voice. She kept her eyes on the guards, counted their steps, measured the distance, and understood with a cold clarity that she was about to learn something fundamental about the difference between innocence and the appearance of it. The guards were not rough. That surprised her slightly. They took her tray, and 2 of them flanked her, and one said, "Come with us," without additional threat or explanation. Professional. Which in some ways was more frightening than anger, because professional meant they had done this before, and were not concerned about the outcome. "I didn't poison the wine," she said. "Come with us," the same guard repeated. She came with them. The grand hall moved around her as she crossed it, faces turning, whispers trailing behind her like smoke, lords and delegates watching her walk toward the dais with expressions that ranged across the full spectrum from cold calculation to something that looked almost like relief. There is a particular quality that settles over a room when an explanation has been provided, regardless of whether that explanation is accurate. Someone to blame has enormous social utility. It allows everyone else to reconfigure their fear into something more manageable. She saw it happening in real time and she cataloged it, and she kept walking. At the base of the dais, the guard stopped. Emperor Kalen looked down at her from the high throne. This close, she could see details the distance had not permitted. There was a thin scar along his left jaw that official portraits did not include. His eyes were a color she did not have a clean word for. Not gray, not precisely green. Something in between that looked different depending on the light. He was reading her the same way he had been reading the room, comprehensive, unsentimental. "Tell me your name," he said. "Not what is your name. Tell me." The distinction was subtle, but it was there. "Alara," she said. "From the Westfall Border Registry. I've been on temporary assignment for 11 days. How long have you been in this room?" "Since the preparation chamber closed at 4 hours past midday, approximately 6 hours." "What did you see?" She held his gaze and she thought about what that question actually asked and what it implied that he was asking it. Not what did you do? Not why did you poison the Duke? What did you see? He was already operating on information she did not yet have, already 3 steps past the assumption of obvious guilt that everyone else in this room had arrived at. "I need to know first whether you want an answer or an accusation," she said, "because those are different things, and which one I give you depends on what you're actually asking." Silence opened around her like a physical space. She heard at least 2 sharp intakes of breath from the guard contingent. Kalen's expression did not change, but something shifted behind the color that didn't have a name eyes, something that might have been calculation, or might have been something she could not yet identify. "An answer," he said. "Speak plainly." So she did. "I didn't poison anyone," she began. "I don't have access to anything that could produce that result, and I have no reason to want a Duke of Caldris dead. I didn't know enough about your court politics 11 days ago to develop a reason, and I still don't. You can investigate my background through the Westfall Registry. There is nothing there." "Continue," Kalen said. In the preparation chamber, approximately 90 minutes before the banquet, there was a collision near the service entrance. 2 guards and a steward blocking a noble's attendant. The argument lasted about 30 seconds. During that time, the chamberlain's velvet tray was jostled and both ceremonial goblets were displaced. She paused. She needed him to understand what she was about to say. "I caught them," she said, "both of them, before they hit the floor, and I set them back." The room registered this slowly, the way a heavy stone registers in still water. "You moved the goblets," said one of the guard captains. Not a question. "I prevented them from breaking against a stone floor," she said, keeping her eyes on Kalen. "And when I set them back, I set them in the wrong positions. The high goblet went left. The secondary went right." She watched him calculate it. "The poison was in the high goblet," he said. It was not a question either. "I don't know that for certain," she said. "You'd need to test what's in both cups now. But if the poison was intended for the high goblet, intended for you, and I accidentally switched them, then Duke Vorik drank what was meant for you. And whoever poisoned that wine is now standing somewhere in this room watching you interrogate a border province servant who has no idea how deep this goes." The grand hall was absolutely quiet. 300 people. The fires and the crystal torches. The distant sound of something, wind, or a crowd beyond the palace walls beginning to understand that something terrible was occurring inside, and the silence of a room where everyone was doing mathematics and arriving at terrifying conclusions. Kalen stood. He did not stand in the way rulers stand in performances, the sweeping rise, the deliberate projection. He stood the way a man stands when he has been sitting long enough and has decided what to do next. Simple. Final. "Seal the preparation chamber," he said to the guard captain nearest him. "Nothing leaves it. No one enters. I want every person who was in that room between the 3rd hour and the 6th hour detained and inventoried." The captain moved. "House Caldris Medics Tavarik. Now. He's not dead yet." To another guard. "I need Chamberlain Austin in the inner council room before I arrive there. If he has left the palace, you find him. Your Majesty. The guard moved. Kalen descended the dais steps. He stopped in front of Alara. This close, she could hear him breathe. She could see the specific quality of the tension he was carrying. It was not fear, she decided. It was something more disciplined than fear. Controlled anger, maybe, at something that had been done to him. The particular internal weather of a man who had survived enough to know what his vulnerabilities looked like, and was already cataloging which one had been exploited tonight. You didn't run, he said. Where would I go? She said. You sealed the exits. They were sealed after you were already in custody. She held his gaze. Then the answer is, I didn't run because I didn't do anything wrong, and running was going to get me killed before I could say so. Most people don't think that clearly when guards are walking toward them. Most people, she said, haven't spent 11 days memorizing which stewards read their inventory lists. Something happened in the complicated color of his eyes. She still didn't have a word for it. Come with me, he said. You said that already, she said. Through your guards. Now I'm saying it myself. She came with him. The inner council room was 3 corridors and 2 locked gates from the grand hall, and it smelled of old paper and cold stone and something faintly metallic that Alara identified as the particular quality of a room where important decisions had been made over many years by people who were accustomed to the consequences of those decisions affecting other people rather than themselves. Chamberlain Austin was already there, standing near the far wall, with the posture of a man who understood that his recent choices had created a geography of trouble he had not fully mapped. His face was pale in the way faces go when the blood has been asked to do too much in too short a time. 3 senior Imperial guards stood at intervals around the room. Kalen did not sit. Austin, he said, no title, no ceremony. Your Majesty, I must protest the circumstances of this summons. The wine was resealed, Kalen said, between its delivery and the preparation chamber's closure. I want to know who resealed it, and I want to know in what sequence the goblets were filled. Austin's carefully assembled indignation faltered at its structural support. The delivery protocols were followed precisely according to Austin. Just his name again. The repetition of it meant something different than the first time. The Chamberlain looked at Alara. Something crossed his face that she catalogued and filed. It was not guilt exactly. It was the more complicated expression of a man who has constructed a specific version of events and is watching someone else stand in a place that version did not anticipate. The wine was inspected by the palace physician upon delivery, Austin said slowly. The reseal was a quality measure, standard summit protocol. Show me the protocol document, Kalen said. Austin said nothing. There isn't one, Kalen said. He was not asking. Austin said nothing again, but his hands, which had been flat against his thighs, moved slightly. A small, involuntary adjustment that had the quality of a man reaching for a door that isn't there. Alara watched him. She was constructing the architecture of what had happened tonight, the way she had constructed the architecture of the preparation chamber's final 15 minutes. Piece by piece. The sequence matters. The sequence always matters. Who was in the room and when. What they touched. What they saw. What they were positioned to see. Someone had put poison in the high goblet. Someone who had access to the preparation chamber and a reason to want the Emperor dead. The wine's reseal was either an attempt to explain the taste or an attempt to cover the introduction of something that changed the wine after delivery. The goblets were identical because they were designed to be. That was ceremonial protocol. No one was supposed to be able to tell them apart from across a room. No one except someone who knew which position corresponded to which throne seat and had enough access to make sure the correct goblet reached the correct position. Unless a border province servant with 11 days of palace experience caught them both mid-fall and accidentally reversed everything. She looked at the Chamberlain and she thought about the word mastermind, and she thought about the way he had announced, in front of everyone, that fingerprints on the wrong cup would send someone to the garrison mines. He had been establishing who handled those cups. He had been setting the terms of the investigation before the investigation began. He knew about the goblets, she said. Kalen turned to look at her. He was the one who positioned them, she said. Not just tonight. The positioning of the goblets is his responsibility by protocol. He knew which one was which. If the poison was in the high goblet and you were supposed to drink from the high goblet, he either put it there or he cleared the room for someone who did. Austin moved. He went for the door nearest him with the speed of a man who had been measuring the distance for several minutes, and he almost made it, which was a testament to how carefully he had positioned himself in the room. The guard nearest the door was marginally slower to react than Austin anticipated, but there were 3 guards, and the other 2 were faster. They had him before he reached the corridor. He was not gentle about it. He pulled against the guard's grip, and one of them took a strike to the jaw that would produce a bruise for a week. And somewhere in the controlled violence of the struggle, something fell from Austin's coat. A small sealed letter, the kind that is carried inside a lining specifically so it is not discovered in a standard search. It hit the stone floor. Everyone looked at it. No one moved to pick it up except Kalen, who crossed the room in 4 unhurried steps and lifted it and broke the seal. He read for approximately 10 seconds. Then he lowered the letter and looked at Alara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the measuring quality, not the controlled anger. Something else. Something that had the particular texture of a man who has just discovered that the problem he thought he was solving is a different problem entirely, and the problem he is actually dealing with is larger and older, and has already been running for much longer than the current evening. The preparation chamber, he said, and his voice had changed. What is it? She asked. He did not answer directly. He folded the letter. He held it for a moment. How precise is your memory? He asked. Precise enough, she said. I need you to tell me every person you observed in that preparation chamber. Every face, every sequence. From the moment you entered to the moment the wine was poured. That's going to take time. I have time, Kalen said. What I don't have is another person in this building who was in that room and is not currently under suspicion of being part of what was planned for tonight. She understood what he was offering her. Not safety exactly, not freedom, but a different position than the one she had occupied 60 seconds ago. A position that had different risks and different possibilities. And what am I, she said, exactly, in this arrangement? Right now? He held her gaze. The most valuable person in this palace. That, she said carefully, is a very specific kind of dangerous. Yes, Kalen said. It is. She told him everything she had seen. It took 40 minutes, sitting across from each other at the council table with 2 guards at the door and a scribe who arrived 15 minutes in to begin transcribing. Alara spoke in the same way she organized her memory, sequentially, specifically, without editorializing. She described faces and positions and time intervals and the particular choreography of the argument at the entrance and what she had observed about the sealed cask's smell. Kalen interrupted occasionally, not to correct her, but to probe a specific detail. His questions were precise, the way surgical tools are precise, designed to enter a specific place and extract a specific thing without disturbing what was adjacent. She realized partway through that he was not simply gathering information. He was also evaluating her. The precision of the questions was not only about what she knew, it was about how she knew it, whether she was constructing a narrative after the fact or whether she was actually reporting something she had genuinely observed. She understood this because she was evaluating him in the same way. And what she observed was a man who had built an empire on the ability to distinguish between loyalty and its performance, between capability and its claim, between what people said they were and what they demonstrated themselves to be when the pressure became specific. 9 years on a throne that attracted betrayal more reliably than devotion. He had not survived that through dominance alone. Dominance produces compliance. Compliance and loyalty are different animals, and only one of them shows up when the palace is burning. This was what it cost to rule, not the battles, which were comprehensible in their violence, but the endless calibration of who to trust when trust had been proven again and again to be the most exploitable thing a ruler possessed. When she finished, he sat for a moment in the particular quiet of someone sorting through a large quantity of new information against an existing map of a situation. 12 faces, he said finally. 12 that I would recognize with confidence, she said. There were others I had peripheral observation on, but the light was variable, and I can't commit to what I can't be certain of. 12 is a starting point. What was in the letter? She asked. He looked at her. You folded it before I could read it, she said. And the way your voice changed when you were done tells me it wasn't a secondary authorization for the assassination attempt. If it were that simple, you'd be angrier and you'd be moving faster. The fact that you're still sitting here asking about the preparation chamber means you think tonight was the beginning of something rather than the end of it. The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. You speak remarkably freely to an emperor, Kaelin said. I speak freely to anyone when the alternative is being executed for a crime I didn't commit and possibly dying without understanding why, she said. If there are protocols I'm violating, we can discuss them after we've established that I'm going to be alive in the morning. Something in his expression fractured very slightly. Not broke, fractured. The smallest version of the kind of expression that lives beneath composed surfaces and only appears when the composure is asked to carry something it wasn't engineered for. Almost like amusement, but older than amusement, more complicated. The letter names an architect, he said finally. Of the assassination? Of what comes after the assassination? She considered this. There's a succession document, he said, and his voice was careful now in the specific way that voices become careful when they are carrying information that is both important and dangerous to transmit. The letter references it. It claims bloodline evidence regarding a legitimate heir to the Ashbourne line, someone who was never formally recognized, but whose existence has apparently been documented and preserved for exactly this kind of moment. She understood immediately. A replacement emperor, she said. A succession crisis, he said, which is different. A replacement emperor can be contested by force. A succession crisis becomes institutional. It enters every lord's calculation, every house's political strategy, every border kingdom's decision about whether their military commitments to the empire remain binding. It's not an assassination anymore. It's a dissolution. The Grand Hall, the 7 Alpha houses. The particular way the Blackfin contingent had moved their lord behind 4 guards in under 4 seconds. They knew, she said. Some of them knew this was coming. Not all, Kaelin said, but enough. He stood again and moved to the small window cut high in the council room's stone wall. Outside, the city of Valdoran would be asleep at this hour, or should be. She could hear faintly the sound of movement in the streets that was not the usual movement of a sleeping city. The word was already out. How bad is it going to get? She asked. He turned from the window. Tell me something first, he said. When you caught those goblets, before you reset them, did you see anything unusual about either cup? Anything on the interior, the rim, the base? She thought back. Precise. She was good at precise. The high goblet had a mark on the base, she said. Inside the Ashbourne crest. A small line. I thought it was a casting flaw when I saw it. I didn't pay attention to it because I was focused on not dropping either cup. A marking, Kaelin said. Yes, so that someone handling the goblet in low light, quickly, could identify which cup was which without checking the positions. She understood what he was saying. The switch wasn't an accident, he said. Or rather, your switch was an accident. But someone had already set it up to be switched back if anyone noticed. There was a failsafe. Meaning someone else was supposed to correct the positions. Meaning someone else in that preparation chamber was watching for exactly this kind of accident and had instructions to fix it. One of the 12 faces, she said, or one of the peripheral ones. She felt the specific cold that arrives when a problem you thought you had contained reveals its actual scale. The preparation chamber was not a passive location. It was an active operation. Multiple participants. Layered instructions. People in it who appeared to be doing one thing while doing another. And she had been in it for 6 hours, observing everything, which meant whoever had been running the operation in that chamber now knew exactly what she had seen. They know I was watching, she said. Yes, Kaelin said. They know I can identify faces. Yes. And they know that you haven't executed me, which means they know that you're treating me as a witness rather than the perpetrator. Yes. She sat very still for a moment. So I am, she said, considerably more dangerous to them alive than dead. That, Kaelin said, is an accurate assessment. The door to the inner council room opened without a knock. That alone was enough. A door that should require a knock being opened without one meant that whoever was entering had either sufficient rank to override the protocol or had already made the decision that the protocol no longer applied to them. It was a guard captain. Not one of the three currently in the room. A new one, arriving from the outer corridors with the specific posture of someone who has been running and has stopped in order to deliver information in a controlled manner. "Your Majesty," the captain said. "There's movement at the eastern barracks." Kalen turned. "Define movement," he said. "House Blackfin Cavalry," the captain said. "They haven't crossed into Imperial territory. They're positioned at the third marker, waiting." "For what?" The captain's expression carried the information before his words arrived. "For a signal from inside the palace, we believe." Kalen looked at Alara. She looked at him. The signal had not come yet, but whoever was supposed to send it was still inside the palace, still inside the 12 faces she had memorized, still somewhere in the corridors between this room and the burning question of what tonight was actually designed to begin. And then the lights went out. Not dimmed, gone. All of them simultaneously, across the corridor, the visible gap under the council room door going dark in the same heartbeat as the torches above them, as if something had extinguished the entire eastern wing at once. The guards moved. The scribe made a sound. Kalen's hand went to the sword at his side that she had not noticed until this moment. And from somewhere outside the council room door, in the dark corridor, someone screamed a name. Her name. The darkness was not silent. That was the first thing Alara registered. Not the absence of light itself, but what the absence revealed. Sounds that the torchlight had been masking rose into sudden clarity. Breathing. The shift of boots against stone. The specific quality of a room full of trained fighters recalibrating position by sound alone. And her name, still hanging in the air outside the door, screamed in a voice she did not recognize. "Don't move," Kalen said. Not to her specifically, to the room. The command carried the quality of a man who had given orders in darkness before and knew that unnecessary movement in close quarters with drawn weapons was how friendly casualties happened. No one moved. She counted her own heartbeats and used them to construct the geography of the room from memory. Council table, 12 feet long, running east to west. 3 guards, last positions at the door and the 2 side walls. The scribe had been at the table's northern end. Kalen had been at the window. She was at the table's center on the western bench. The door was still closed. Whoever had screamed her name was in the corridor. "Captain," Kalen said, low and specific. "Your Majesty." One of the guards. The senior one. She could tell by where the voice originated, which matched the position she had assigned him. "What is the standard procedure when the Eastern Wing torches are extinguished?" A half-second pause, long enough to be meaningful. "There is no standard procedure for that scenario, Your Majesty. It's never happened." "Then we operate on first principles." Kalen's voice moved. He was not staying at the window. "The corridor outside this door, what is it connected to?" "The inner archive passage on the left, the secondary servant corridor on the right. Both connect to the outer ring within 40 paces." "The servant corridor," Alara said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she had expected. Silence. "Say that again," Kalen said. "The secondary servant corridor is how I memorized the inner palace route," she said. 11 days of carrying trays. I know where it goes. And I know that if you're trying to move someone through this building in the dark without encountering the main guard positions, that corridor is the correct route. "Move someone or move something," the captain said. "Both," she said. Another silence. Different quality this time. The silence of people arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. "They're not coming in," Kalen said. "No," she agreed. "They're moving past." "Yes." The darkness thought about this with them for a moment. Then Kalen said, "We go into the corridor." The guard captain argued, not insubordinately. He was too well trained for that, but with the specific persistence of someone whose professional obligation required him to name every risk before accepting a decision. "The corridor is an unknown variable at this point, Your Majesty. We have active threat conditions, unknown number of actors, and no visual capacity. Standard protocol in these circumstances is to hold the secured room and wait for backup to reestablish perimeter. Standard protocol assumes the threat is trying to reach us," Kalen said. "This one is trying to reach something else, which means every second we stay in this room is a second they spend getting to where they're going." You don't know where they're going. She does. The captain's silence had a shape to it. She could feel it even without seeing his face. The preparation chamber, she said. The evidence is still there. If someone orchestrated tonight from inside that chamber and they know the chamber has been sealed, the logical move right now is to reach it and sanitize whatever they left behind before your forensic teams get there in the morning. I ordered that room sealed immediately, Kaylin said. And whoever you sent to seal it, she said carefully, was selected from the staff available in the Grand Hall at the time of Varick's collapse. The weight of that settled over the room with the specific density of implications no one wanted to be the first to say aloud. 12 faces in the preparation chamber. Unknown number of collaborators. An operation with enough reach to extinguish an entire wing's lighting system. And the Imperial Guard Corps, whose upper ranks had been filtered through a decade of political appointments made by lords who were now sitting in the Grand Hall watching the Emperor's response to a crisis that some of them had helped design. Trust was the most exploitable thing a ruler possessed. Kaylin had said that, in different words. But this was what it looked like from the inside. Not the philosophical truth of it, but the lived geography. Every person in reach was a calculation. Every action had to account for the possibility that the hands executing it were connected to the problem. "I'll go first," the guard captain said finally. The argument was done. He had done his professional duty, and now he would do his professional function. "No," Kaylin said. "I go first." "Your Majesty, if someone is in this corridor, and their objective is in the preparation chamber, they are not looking for me. My presence is unpredictable, and that is an advantage." He paused. "You two on my flanks. You at the rear." She stays between the rear guard and the middle pair. "My name is Alara," she said. "I know your name," Kaylin said. She heard him move toward the door. "Then use it," she said, "when you're giving instructions that affect my survival." 4 seconds of silence. "Alara stays between the rear guard and the middle pair," Kaylin said, and opened the door. The corridor was not entirely dark. That became clear in the first 3 seconds after the door opened. There was a source of ambient light coming from the far end, faint, directional, the particular color of something burning at low intensity rather than the white gold of palace torches. Emergency pitch fire, maybe, or something that had been lit deliberately to serve as a navigational marker for people who knew where they were going. Kaylin moved left. She understood why immediately. The light was coming from the right, which meant anyone moving through this corridor toward the servant passage would be moving from right to left, and positioning on the left wall gave them a geometric advantage in identifying incoming movement against what little illumination existed. Her boots on the stone. The guards' boots. No one was announcing their footsteps, but complete silence was impossible. The corridor was cut stone, the kind that carried sound laterally in ways that outdoor environments did not. She cataloged the ambient sounds as she moved. Distant voices. Multiple. From the direction of the Grand Hall. The summit guests had not been dispersed yet, which meant 300 nobles and delegates were still in a sealed room processing the information that their host had just survived an assassination attempt whose full scope remained unclear. A lower sound, further away. Something that might have been a door, and breathing, not theirs. She caught Kaylin's arm in the dark before she understood she was going to do it, the same instinct that had moved her hands toward the falling goblets. Not a decision, but a response. Her fingers found the sleeve of his coat and tightened once, sharply, and stopped moving. He stopped. The guards stopped. 40 feet ahead, in the section of corridor where the ambient light from the far end began to gray the darkness into something navigable, a shape moved along the wall. One person, moving quickly but without running. The specific quality of someone who had done this route before and was operating from a memorized map rather than current visual information. Kaylin did not move for 4 seconds. Then he said, at full voice, into the dark, "Stop where you are." The shape stopped. The silence after was extraordinary in its texture. "Turn around," Kaylin said. The shape turned. The ambient light at this distance was not enough for facial identification, but it was enough to see the shape of someone in servant livery, holding something against their chest with both arms, something that had the rectangular geometry of a document case. "Put it down," Kaylin said. The shape did not put it down. Instead, it did something that took a half second to register. It took one step back, and then another, and then it ran. Not toward the servant corridor. Away from it. Back toward the light source at the far end, which was the wrong direction if the preparation chamber was the objective, which meant either the shape did not know the layout as well as she had assumed, or the preparation chamber was not the objective, or this was not the person she had expected to find in this corridor at all. "Go," Kaelin said, and the two forward guards were already moving. They were faster. The servant livery was not designed for running, and the person wearing it was not a trained guard. They had them in the section of corridor where the ambient light was strongest, and one guard's hand found the shape's shoulder, and the momentum ended against the wall. She heard the impact. She heard the document case hit the floor. She heard a voice say, very clearly, and with the particular enunciation of someone choosing precision over volume, "You will hang for this, every one of you." It was not a threat. It was a statement of professional conviction from someone who believed completely in the institutional weight behind it. Kaelin arrived at the same time she did. In the light, she could see a face. A woman, approximately 45, silver in her dark hair, a scar along her right collarbone that was visible above the servant livery's neckline, which meant the livery was borrowed and did not fit correctly. Her eyes were the flat, immediate eyes of someone who had decided not to be afraid and was implementing that decision through sheer structural will. "I know you," Alara said. The woman looked at her. "You were in the preparation chamber," Alara said. "You were checking the floral arrangements on the secondary trays. You had a small bag at your left hip." The woman's flat eyes shifted approximately 2 degrees. That was all. "The bag," Kaelin said to the guard who had her arm. The guard checked the livery. Found it. Small, leather, the kind that tied shut with a double knot. He held it up. "Open it," Kaelin said. The guard opened it. He looked at what was inside for a moment. Then he turned and held it so the ambient light caught the contents and held them for everyone to see. A copper measuring rod, identical to the one Chamberlain Austin used to check the goblet levels, and beneath it, a small glass vial, empty now, that still held the trace smell of dark plums and something sharper underneath. Shan. Her name was Cien. She confirmed that much and nothing else for the first 20 minutes, which she spent in the secure anteroom adjacent to the council chamber with her hands bound at the wrist and her expression set to the particular variation of contempt that people use when they have decided that the people questioning them do not deserve the performance of cooperation. Kaelin sat across from her. Alara sat at the table's edge where she could see both their faces. The two guards stood at the door. "You were positioned to correct the goblet switch," Kaelin said. Not a question. He had moved past questions some time ago. When the servant from Westfall reset the cups in the wrong order, your job was to identify the error using the base mark and fix it before the procession entered. Cien looked at the wall behind him. "You didn't," he said. She continued looking at the wall. "I want to understand that part," he said, "because the rest of it I can reconstruct. The access to the preparation chamber was through a supplier connection. The wine delivery is the logical entry point, which is why it was resealed. The vial was introduced between delivery and the physician's inspection window, which is a gap of approximately 20 minutes. Austin cleared the room during that window, which he had the authority to do as Chamberlain. 2 people, minimum, to manage the introduction. You and at least one other." Cien's eyes moved to him for approximately 1 second, then back to the wall. "But you didn't correct the goblets," he said. "When the error happened right in front of you, you let it stand, which means one of 2 things. Either you decided in that moment to let Duke Varric die instead of me, which would require a specific reason, or someone told you to let it stand regardless." A longer silence. "The bag," Alara said. Both of them looked at her. "She was taking the vial and the measuring rod out of the palace," Alara said. "Not to the preparation chamber. She was taking them out. The objective wasn't to sanitize the evidence in the chamber. She was carrying the evidence herself, which means she was planning to leave." She looked at Cien. "You were done. Your part was finished, and you were getting out." Cien's jaw moved slightly, the specific movement of someone controlling a response that almost escaped. "You let Varric die," Alara said, "because at the last second someone changed the instruction, and the changed instruction made your exit possible, because once an assassination has occurred and the room is in chaos, One more servant disappearing into the dark is less noticeable than it would have been if the evening had ended normally. The flatness in Cien's eyes developed a fracture. Small, but it was there. They told you to let it happen, Ilara said. Whoever is running this told you at some point between the preparation chamber and the banquet that the target had changed, or that two targets were better than one, and you followed the instruction. Who told you? Kaelin said. Cien looked at him directly for the first time. This was a different quality of looking, not the professional contempt she had been deploying. Something more personal. Almost curious. The way a person looks at someone they have studied from a distance and are now encountering at close range for the first time. "You're asking the wrong question," she said. Her voice was low and precise. The accent was not regional. It was the particular accent of someone educated in multiple places who had smoothed out the specifics until the voice belonged to no particular territory. "Tell me the right question," Kaelin said. "The right question," Cien said, "is why I'm still in this palace." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences in the evening. This one had intention in it. "I had a clean route," she said. "I've run exits from more difficult positions than this. If my objective was to disappear, I would have disappeared." She looked at the document case still in the guard's hands. "I was in that corridor because I wanted to be found." Kaelin's expression did not change, but she saw the thing in his eyes again, the fracture in the composure, the thing that lived beneath the controlled surface and only surfaced when the problem revealed a shape he had not anticipated. "Why?" he said. "Because what's in that case," Cien said, "is the only copy of the succession document that Chancellor Malrek hasn't already placed in front of the Alpha Council." The name fell into the room like a stone into deep water. It did not splash. It simply descended. Chancellor Malrek. The word moved through Ilara's understanding of the evening and rearranged everything around itself the way a single correct piece rearranges a puzzle you have been working for hours. The architect of the Empire's finances. The one man every noble believed incapable of treason. A name she had heard in 11 days of palace service, the way you hear the names of weather systems. As a feature of the landscape, something vast and structurally permanent that you do not question because it has always been there. Kaelin said nothing for a long time. This was a different quality of silence than his previous ones. The previous silences had been thinking silences, calculation silences. This one was something older. The silence of a man who has just learned that a threat he did not know to measure has already been active for longer than he can currently determine. "How long?" he said. 20 years, Cien said, "since before you took the throne." The full weight of that number required a moment to process. 20 years. The duration of a grown human life. The length of a career. Long enough for a conspiracy to develop infrastructure, relationships, legal architecture. Long enough for the people involved to have children, and for those children to grow up understanding their role in it. Long enough for the thing to become institutional in its own right. Not a plot, but a parallel structure. "He didn't want to kill you," Cien said. "He wanted to destabilize the succession. A dead emperor with no designated heir and a forged bloodline document produces a council crisis that can run for years. Years in which the Alpha houses are too busy fighting each other's claims to notice what he's building." "What is he building?" Kaelin said. "Debt," she said simply. "He's been the architect of the Empire's finances for 15 years. He knows where every obligation runs. He knows which houses have borrowed against future revenues, which lords have mortgaged their military capacity to fund personal ambitions, which border kingdoms survive only because of imperial trade relationships that can be adjusted." She paused. "A man who holds the paper on everyone doesn't need an army. He needs a moment when the political will to enforce existing obligations collapses. A succession crisis gives him that moment." "And the succession document," Ilara said. Cien looked at her. The curiosity was back. "The woman in the document," Ilara said, because she had already run the mathematics, "is not a legitimate heir. She's a name on a forged record, but the record is sophisticated enough that the Alpha Council will require months to disprove it, and during those months the crisis runs." "The woman named in the document," Cien said, "is currently standing in this room." The silence that followed was the longest one of the evening. Ilara heard her own breathing change. She heard the guard at the door shift his weight. She heard, distant and muffled through stone walls, the continued sound of movement in the streets of Valdoran that was not the sound of a sleeping city. She looked at Kalen. He was already looking at her. "Tell me," she said, and her voice came out strange, flattened in some way she could not entirely control. "What is in that document case?" It was 47 pages. The guard captain brought a torch from the outer corridor, and she read the document case's contents at the council table, while Kalen stood 3 feet away with his arms crossed and an expression that had passed through several phases in the last 10 minutes and had settled somewhere between contained fury and the particular weariness of a man who had stopped being surprised by the scale of human deception and was now simply cataloging it. The documents were thorough. That was the correct word. They were not rough. They had been constructed with the care of someone who understood that the weakness of a forged record was not in individual details, but in the consistency of the whole, and had therefore built a system rather than a document. Birth records from a Westfall border garrison. Dated approximately 24 years ago. An unmarked servant recorded as a temporary resident. A pregnancy noted in the garrison physician's log. A transfer request 2 months later to a different assignment. The thread was deliberate, minimal, consistent. The record of a woman who had been managed out of a situation rather than celebrated into one. Census records placing a child in the border province of Westfall. The name different. A common name, not the emperor's, not the mother's alleged name. Alara understood this immediately. You do not give a secret child a distinctive name. You give it the most forgettable one available. Her mother's name was on the garrison physician's log. She stared at that for a long time. The physician's log was either genuine or the most sophisticated forgery she had ever seen, and she was aware that she was not qualified to distinguish between those two possibilities, and that this awareness was precisely the ground on which the document's power stood. "This is what you were taking out," she said. "A copy," Cien said. She had not been removed from the room. "Malrek has the primary. He was going to introduce it to the Alpha Council at the 3rd session of the summit, 2 days from now, following the assassination, because an assassination followed by a succession document is a crisis. An assassination that fails, followed by a succession document, is still a crisis, but one with a different shape." "He'll introduce it anyway," Alara said. "Yes, because the assassination failing does not eliminate the document." "No." She set down the 47 pages. There was a particular experience that she did not have language for yet. It would develop language later, in the days when she would have time to process it. But in that moment, it arrived as a physical sensation in her chest, somewhere between pressure and cold. The experience of watching your own history become a weapon in someone else's hands. The experience of understanding that your existence, your origin, your mother's name in a garrison physician's log, had been identified and cataloged and preserved not because anyone cared about you, but because you were useful. A border province servant. Invisible by design. Easy to produce, easy to discard, easy to project the necessary narrative onto because she had no power of her own to contest it with, except that she was currently sitting in the Emperor's inner council room at 3 a.m, and the Emperor was 3 feet away, and he was looking at her with the measuring quality that she had learned was how he looked at problems he had not yet decided how to solve. "You're calculating," she said. "Always," he said. "You're calculating what I'm worth." Something moved across his face. Not flinching. He was not a man who flinched, but an acknowledgement, the specific quality of an acknowledgement from someone who does not offer them easily. "You're calculating," she said, "whether the document is more dangerous as a tool of Malrek's or as a tool of yours." The guard captain made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Kalen said nothing. "If you use it," she said, "you control the succession narrative. You have the claimant, which means you have the crisis on a leash. The alpha houses that were planning to use Malrek's version of this story as leverage against you lose their leverage because you've already absorbed the story into your own position." "Yes, Kalen said. "And I become a political instrument." "Yes." She looked at the 47 pages in front of her. Every alpha sovereign eventually discovers that the crown attracts betrayal more reliably than devotion. He had said something like that during the first hour of the investigation. She had not entirely understood at the time what that cost looked like from the inside. This was what it looked like. The moment where there are no options between right and wrong, only choices about which wound the situation can endure. What I want to know, she said, is whether the document is true. The room was very still. Because if it's forged, she said, then what you're proposing is building your political response on a fiction. And the fiction will eventually develop cracks. And when it cracks, I'm not a tool anymore. I'm evidence of something worse than what Malric was doing. She looked at him. But if it's true, if my mother was in that garrison and those records are real, then what you're proposing is a different kind of wrong. Because it means I've been living a life without knowing what I was living, and you'd be asking me to weaponize that without even giving me the time to understand it. Kalen looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cien. Is the document true? He said. Cien met his gaze. The birth record is authentic, she said. The garrison physician's log is authentic. The census records are authentic. The connective documentation between them was constructed by Malric's people, the narrative that links the pieces into a succession claim. But the pieces themselves are real, Ilara said. The pieces are real, Cien confirmed. The pressure and cold in her chest became something else. Not larger, more specific. She was the daughter of a woman who had spent 22 years as a laundress at a border garrison because she could not go back to wherever she had been before. A woman who had taught her daughter to notice everything, say nothing, and become furniture. A woman who had perhaps done this not because it was the survival philosophy of the powerless, but because it was the survival philosophy of someone who knew exactly how powerful the wrong people's attention could be. She knew, Ilara said, to no one specifically. No one answered. She did not need them to. Outside the palace walls, the city of Valdoran was not sleeping. She could hear it clearly now. The sound of it had been growing for the last hour, and it had passed some threshold that turned background noise into foreground reality. People in streets, not rioting, not yet, but awake and moving in the particular pattern of a population that has received enough information to be afraid, but not enough to know what direction fear should face. The Chancellor had not waited for morning to begin his work. He's already moving, she said. Kalen crossed to the window again, the same window he had stood at earlier in the evening when the letter had changed his voice. The council assembly convenes in 6 hours, he said. He'll introduce the document at first session. Then we have 6 hours, she said. To do what? The guard captain said. She looked at the 47 pages. She looked at the small glass vial, still sitting in its evidence position on the secondary table where the guard had placed it. She looked at Chamberlain Austin, who was being held in the anteroom and who had not yet explained who had given him his instructions for the evening or how long those instructions had been in place. She looked at Cien, who had wanted to be found, which meant Cien had decided at some point that whatever loyalty had brought her to this evening's work was no longer sufficient to the situation, which meant Cien had information she had decided to exchange for something, and the exchange had not yet been negotiated. She looked at Kalen, who was at the window, whose posture had the quality of a man who had been in worse positions and survived them, and was therefore neither panicking nor pretending the situation was manageable. Something between those two. The specific equilibrium of someone who operates best when the options are genuinely bad. We need to get into the main archive, she said. Kalen turned from the window. The succession laws, she said. The original charter documents. If Malrec's claim is built on specific articles of imperial law, we need to know exactly which articles they are and whether those articles have been amended at any point in the last 24 years, because if they have been amended and the amendments were managed by the Chancellor's office, then the amendments themselves are part of the construction, Kalen said. Yes, the main archive is locked by dual key, the captain said. Imperial seal and council seal. The council seal is held by... He stopped. Everyone in the room arrived at the same point at the same time. The council seal was held by the Chancellor, by Malrec. Kalen's expression was not anger. It had moved past anger into the colder territory that lives on the other side of it, the place where a person realizes that what they thought was a problem is actually a system, and that every element of the system that they try to address has already been accounted for by whoever built it, 20 years. There's another way in, Ilara said. The archive is stone-walled and single entrance by construction, the captain said. The archive, she said, connects to the secondary servant passage. I know because I spent 3 days of my 11 in this palace carrying documents between the filing rooms and the outer offices, and the route goes through a door that the archive staff use for materials transport. It is not locked by dual key because it is not considered an entrance. It's considered a service hatch. The captain looked at her. Kaylin looked at her. No one documented it as a security consideration, she said, because no one who makes those decisions has ever had a reason to move through this building as anything other than a person with a title and a direct route. The particular quality of the silence that followed was one she had not encountered before in the evening. It was the silence of people reconsidering a fundamental assumption, specifically the assumption about which kind of knowledge was strategically valuable in a crisis, the kind of knowledge that required power to obtain, or the kind of knowledge that required invisibility. Kaylin moved away from the window. "Show me," he said. Done. The service hatch was exactly where she had said it was, 11 paces down the secondary servant corridor from the point where it intersected with the inner archive's eastern wall. It was not dramatic, a low door, reinforced but not sealed, the latch mechanism a simple iron bar of the type used throughout the palace's service infrastructure, because simple mechanisms were reliable mechanisms, and reliability mattered more than security when you were moving paper. The captain checked it. The bar lifted. "Materials transport," Kaylin said, low. 17 trips in 3 days, she said. "I can tell you the weight limit of the inner shelf system, and which of the senior archivists keeps their tea too hot, and which one has a habit of leaving reference indexes on the wrong shelves. I can also tell you that the succession law documents are filed in the third tier of the southern stack under Imperial Charter, which is the second stack from the left when you enter from this side." Kaylin looked at her. "I know," she said. "I notice things." Something in his expression settled. Not softened, that was not the right word, and she would have rejected it instinctively. Settled was closer. The way a calculation settles when its components have been established and the working answer emerges. The way a man who has spent an entire evening revising his understanding of a situation arrives at a version of it that can hold the weight he needs it to hold. "You understand," he said, "that once we go in there, and once we find what we find, there is no version of tonight that returns you to the Westfall Labor Registry." She knew. She had known since the moment Cienne had said her name in that anteroom. Perhaps earlier, perhaps since the moment she had set those goblets back on the tray in the wrong order, and the configuration of her life had shifted at a point too small to see with the naked eye. This was what power looked like from the outside, she thought. Not the crown and the throne and the armies, not the declaration and the ceremony. It looked like a service hatch in an unlit corridor at 3 a.m, with everything she had ever been about to cross a threshold she could not uncross. "I know," she said. She pushed the door open. She went through first. The archive in the dark was a different landscape than the archive in the working day. The scale of it registered differently without the ambient noise of the staff's movement, the stacks rising into shadows above the low service lighting, the smell of old parchment and iron gall ink, and the particular dryness of stone that has held the same temperature for 3 centuries. She moved without hesitating. Third tier, southern stack, second from the left. Kaylin stayed close. The guards at the entrance and exit, the captain inside with them, torch in hand, low and directional. Imperial Charter. The documents were exactly where she had said. She did not touch them. That was for Kaylin. She stood back and let him pull the relevant bound volume, watched him find the specific articles by indexing method, while the captain held the torch at the correct angle. The succession articles were in the charter's third section. She watched Kaylin's face while he read. He read 1 page, then a second. Then he stopped, and his hand went back to the previous page, and he read something again more slowly, and she knew from the quality of his stillness that he had found it. "Article 17, he said, low. Not to her specifically, to the document, to the room. Amended in the 14th year of the Ashbourne reign, his 14th year of rule, 3 years ago. "What does the amendment say?" she said. "It narrows the definition of legitimate succession to exclude claims made on behalf of individuals who cannot provide dual verification, documentary evidence, and the testimony of a living witness." He paused. The amendment was registered as a security measure following a contested border inheritance dispute in the Grey Mantle territory. "Who authored the amendment?" she said. He looked up. She already knew. "The Chancellor's office drafted it," he said. "I ratified it in the 14th year because the stated justification was sound. The particular architecture of it assembled in her mind with a precision that was almost elegant. Malric had written the law and then positioned himself as the living witness. The succession document placed in the Council's hands named him as the source of the second verification. He had created the legal framework and then made himself the indispensable component of activating it. Without his testimony, the document was incomplete under the very law he had written. "He controls the activation," she said. "Yes." "Which means the succession crisis only fully triggers if he chooses to testify. And he will only choose to testify if he believes the political moment is right, which means he's not trying to crown a new emperor. He's trying to hold the threat of one over you indefinitely." Kalen closed the charter volume. He stood in the archive's darkness, with the specific quality of a man who has just had the shape of a problem become completely clear to him for the first time, and who is now doing the calculation that follows that clarity. The calculation was visible on his face in the same way that weather is visible from a distance, the specific quality of an internal system moving. "He needs me alive," Kalen said. "Yes," she said. "A dead emperor immediately activates every succession mechanism. A living emperor under a credible threat of succession crisis can be managed, leveraged. The threat is the asset, not the outcome." "He staged an assassination that was designed to fail." "I think so," she said. "I think Varric was the intended victim from the beginning. A dead lord and a botched assassination creates exactly the fear and chaos he needed without actually removing you, because you're worth more to him frightened than dead." Kalen set the volume back. He turned. His face in the low torchlight was not the face of a man who was frightened. It was the face of a man who has spent 9 years learning the specific lesson that power does not protect you from human nature. It simply gives human nature a larger stage to perform on, and who has now seen the performance take a shape that requires a different response than any he has used before. "We go back," he said, "and we wake the Alpha Council." "Now?" the captain said. "It's 4 hours before dawn." "Yes," Kalen said. "Now, before Malric knows what we found." She followed him back through the service hatch. She was in the corridor, the door closed behind her, the darkness of the servant passage around them again, when she heard it. Not a scream this time. Footsteps. Multiple. Organized. Moving from the direction of the grand hall with the particular cadence of armed men who have been given a specific destination and a specific objective and are moving toward both. Too many. Too organized. The captain heard it at the same moment and his hand went to his sword. Kalen stopped walking. She saw, in the faint ambient glow from the passage's far end, the expression on his face when he understood what the sound meant. The Alpha Council had not waited for morning. Or rather, someone speaking for the council had decided that morning was too late, that the political window was already closing, that the moment had to be seized now, in the dark, before whatever the Emperor had discovered in his 3 hours of investigation could be assembled into something that resisted the pressure they were about to apply. 40 feet. 30. The footsteps were not stopping. They were coming for the same corridor. They were coming, she understood in the same heartbeat, for her. The succession crisis had not waited for the Chancellor's formal introduction. It had already begun. The footsteps did not slow. 30 feet, 25. The corridor was narrow enough that the sound filled it completely, bouncing off the cut stone in a way that made the number of approaching bodies difficult to calculate precisely. 8, she guessed. Maybe 10. Moving in the formation of people who had been given authorization, not the tentative movement of men acting outside their mandate, but the settled, purposeful momentum of men who believed the law was behind them. Kalen heard it the same way she did. She knew because he did not draw his sword. A man responding to a direct physical threat draws his sword. A man who recognizes a political situation keeps his hand away from it, because drawing steel in front of an authorized contingent converts a confrontation into an incident, and an incident into a justification for whatever the other side has already decided to do. "Stand," he said to his captain. One word. The captain's hand came away from his sword hilt. The approaching contingent rounded the passage corner and their torchlight arrived before they did, orange and sweeping, pushing the ambient dark back and revealing the narrow corridor in sharp relief. 6 guards in the livery of the Imperial Council. Not the Emperor's personal guard, the Council's own security detachment, which operated under a separate chain of command that ran through the Chancellor's office. Behind them, 2 men in the formal robes of senior council membership. She recognized neither face, but she recognized the quality of how they carried themselves. The posture of men who had been woken from sleep and had dressed quickly and were running on the specific energy of people who believe they are arriving at the correct moment in a situation that has been building for years. The contingent stopped 6 feet from Kalen. The senior council member, older, heavy through the shoulders, with the remnants of a beard that had been fashionable 20 years ago and had become habit, spoke first. "Your Majesty," he said. The title carried the particular inflection of someone using protocol as a container for something that was not respect. "The Council has convened an emergency session. You are requested to attend." "Requested?" Kalen said. "Yes." The words sat between them. In 9 years of ruling, Ilara suspected, no one had requested the Emperor of Valdoran to attend anything. He had been summoned to battlefields and called to negotiations and petitioned by every variety of supplicant the Empire produced. He had not been requested. And the woman, the second council member said, he was younger, sharper in his features, with the eyes of someone who had spent a career looking for edges in situations. His gaze moved to Ilara with the specific quality of a man who has been told what he is looking for and has found it. "She comes with us as well." "She is under my protection," Kalen said. "She is," the sharp-featured man said carefully, "at the center of a succession matter that falls under council jurisdiction. The Chancellor has invoked Article 17. Article 17. The amendment Malrek had written himself 3 years ago under the justification of a border inheritance dispute. The trap set years in advance, waiting for exactly this morning. Kalen did not move. She understood what was happening in the space his stillness occupied. He was calculating the cost of refusing, not in the terms of what he wanted, but in the terms of what refusal would mean for everything that came after. A ruler who refuses a council summons in front of witnesses in the middle of an active political crisis has just handed his opposition the narrative. He becomes the emperor who places himself above institutional process. Every alpha lord who had been uncertain about which side of the coming fracture to position themselves on would suddenly have clarity. This was the architecture of it. Not a trap for tonight, a trap for every night that followed. He moved. "Then we attend," he said, and walked toward the contingent, and they parted to let him through, and she followed, and the corridor closed around all of them in the particular way that situations close around you when the decision has been made and the direction is fixed, and the only remaining variable is how bad the landing will be. Power has a specific pathology that reveals itself most clearly in the moments when it is threatened rather than exercised. A ruler in command is comprehensible. The machinery of authority operates as designed, subordinates respond to direction, the system functions according to its established parameters. But a ruler whose authority is suddenly contested discovers something that no period of unchallenged governance can prepare them for. That every relationship they believed was built on loyalty was in fact built on the perception of power. And perception is the most fragile substance in any political structure. What Kalen walked into in the council chamber was not a meeting. It was the aftermath of a decision that had already been made. The Alpha Lords were assembled. Not all 7, but 5 of them present, with representatives from the remaining 2. The emergency configuration. The faces around the chamber's circular table carried the specific expressions of men who had been awake for several hours and had used those hours to arrive at a position they were now committed to defending regardless of new information. This was the fundamental danger of a conspiracy that moves faster than a response can be assembled. By the time the target understands the full shape of the threat, the architects have already converted their advantage into institutional form. The forged document becomes a motion. The motion becomes a vote. The vote becomes a precedent that is far harder to reverse than any individual decision, because precedents carry the weight of process, and process is the mechanism by which power is laundered into legitimacy. Chancellor Malrek stood at the table's head. She had not seen him before. She built her understanding of him from the 11 days of palace background and from everything the evening had produced. And still, the physical reality of him was different from what she had assembled. He was not physically imposing, medium height, the kind of build that suggested a life spent at desks rather than on campaigns, with a face that had the particular quality of a face that had never been required to display anything its owner did not choose to display. Controlled in the specific way that people who have been performing a particular version of themselves for 2 decades become controlled, not effortfully, but structurally. The performance had become the architecture. He looked at Alara when she entered with the quality of a man examining something he has built from a distance and is now seeing up close for the first time. Not triumph. Something more careful than triumph. Assessment. "Your Majesty," he said, the same inflection as the council member in the corridor. Protocol as container. Kalen did not sit. He stood at the chamber's perimeter. She stood beside him. "The council has reviewed the documentation presented under Article 17, Malrek said. He addressed the assembled lords rather than Kalen, which was itself a statement. "The succession claim meets the evidentiary threshold established by the amendment. The council is prepared to hear the verification testimony." "The verification testimony," Kalen said, "comes from you." "As the custodian of the documentation, yes. Documentation you authored. Documentation I located and preserved," Malrek said. "The records themselves were created by the garrison physician and the census registry. I did not author those." The distinction was technically accurate and functionally dishonest, and everyone in the room understood both of those things simultaneously. "The document is forged," Kalen said. "The council has examined it," the sharp-featured lord from the corridor said. He had taken his seat. His name, she had now gathered from context, was Lord Vecht, House Vecht, the smallest of the Alpha houses, with the particular political style of a small power that survives by positioning itself on what it calculates to be the winning side early enough to claim credit. The examination found no evidence of falsification. "The connective documentation was constructed," Kalen said. "The individual records are genuine. The narrative linking them is a fabrication." "That is an assertion," Malrek said. "Do you have evidence?" The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that occupies a room when the person who should have an answer does not have one that will be credited by the audience they are trying to reach. What they had found in the archive was the legal structure of the trap, the amendment, the framework, the method by which Malrek had made himself indispensable to the activation of the crisis. They had the small glass vial and the copper measuring rod. They had Cien and Austin in custody. They had an understanding of the mechanism. What they did not have was a document that contradicted the succession claim on its own terms. What they did not have was a counter-record, a provable timeline, a witness who could testify with the institutional weight the council had already decided to require. What they had was the word of a border province servant who had been in the palace for 11 days, and the word of the emperor who had every reason in the world to dispute a claim that threatened his throne. "You need time," Alara said, and heard her own voice come out flat and deliberate. Kalen looked at her. "You need time to build the counter-evidence," she said, "and they know that, which is why this session was called at 4 in the morning rather than at the scheduled council hour." The sharp-featured lord, Vecht, looked at her with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being accurately described. "The woman's political commentary," he said, to the room rather than to her, "is not relevant to the evidentiary process." "The woman," Alara said, "is the subject of the evidentiary process, which makes my commentary the most relevant thing currently being said in this room." The room registered this in different ways. Two of the Alpha Lords, Thornwall and the Edenmere representative, shifted in their seats with the quality of people reconsidering something they had been comfortable with moments before. Lord Vecht's jaw tightened. Malrek's expression did not change. "You have one question," Kalen said to her, quiet and direct. She knew what he meant. He was giving her the floor. In a room he could not currently command, he was handing her the one asset they had that Malrek's plan had not fully accounted for. Her. Not the document. Her. She looked at Malrek. "The amendment you wrote," she said. Article 17. Dual verification. Documentary evidence and a living witness. She paused. The living witness is you. Yes, Malric said. You're the only living witness. The documentation speaks for itself. My testimony confirms the provenance. But without your testimony, she said, the document is incomplete under the law you wrote. Malric looked at her. And you wrote that law, she said, because you needed to be the indispensable component. Not because you wanted the succession crisis to succeed tonight, but because you wanted to be able to activate it or deactivate it. Because a crisis you control is an asset. A crisis that runs without you is a liability. The room was very still. Which means, she said, that every lord in this room who believes they are participating in a succession process is actually participating in a leverage mechanism. Malric does not want a new emperor. He wants an emperor who owes him the decision not to produce one. Lord Vecht stood. This is... Sit down, said the Lord of House Thornwall. Vecht sat. The specific submission of a small power recalibrating to a larger one. Thornwall looked at Malric, and here was the fracture. She could see it, the first crack in the constructed surface of the evening. Malric's plan had accounted for opposition from Kaelin. It had accounted for political resistance from the larger houses. It had accounted for almost everything. It had not fully accounted for someone naming the mechanism aloud, in front of everyone before the vote. Because once you name a leverage mechanism as a leverage mechanism, every person in the room who was previously a potential beneficiary of the plan has to recalculate. They are no longer participating in a succession process that might advantage them. They are participating in a scheme that advantages Malric, and their presence is the institutional cover that makes it legitimate. Malric looked at her. For the first time all evening, his expression changed. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for dramatic expression, but something moved underneath the surface. Something with the quality of a man who has just recalibrated his assessment of a variable he had underweighted. Take her to the holding suite, he said. The council guards moved immediately. Kaelin stepped forward. Anyone who touches her answers to me, he said. You are in a council chamber, Malric said, and his voice had changed too, no longer the careful institutional tone. Something harder underneath it, the thing that had been running for 20 years beneath the performed loyalty and the crafted deference. The Emperor's authority in a council chamber is co-equal with the council's authority. You do not have unilateral command here. Then let's take a vote, Thornwall said, on whether she is to be detained pending process. The vote would not go the right way. Alara could read it in the configuration of the room. 5 houses present, Vecht with Malric, Blackfen with Malric, Edenmere uncertain, Thornwall resistant. The 5th house, Caldris, had no representative present because their lord was in the palace physician's wing fighting the poison that had been meant for someone else. 3-2, best case. The motion would pass. The guards had already moved before the vote was called. Professional. Fast. The specific quality of men who had been told not to wait for formal authorization once the signal was given. She did not fight it. There was no physics in which fighting it produced a better outcome than the one she was already in. What she did was look at Kaelin, and what passed between them in that look. In the 3 seconds before the guards moved her past him and toward the chamber's secondary door, was not communication exactly. It was something more specific. An accounting. The rapid mutual recognition between 2 people who have spent the last 4 hours in a situation that required complete honesty and have arrived at a version of trust that neither of them had planned to develop. He would not abandon the counter-evidence. She knew this. She also knew that 6 hours was not enough time, and that Malric had known that when he set the morning session. The door closed behind her. The holding suite was in the palace's inner residential wing, which meant it was considerably more comfortable than a cell and considerably more secure than a room with an unlocked door. Stone walls, a narrow window that looked out over the interior courtyard, furniture that had the quality of items chosen to be unmovable rather than comfortable. A guard outside the door, possibly 2. She sat on the edge of the bed and she breathed, and she did what she always did when the external landscape was temporarily removed from her influence. She thought. The succession document named her. That was the foundation of everything. Whatever her mother's history actually was, and she had not yet had space to sit with that question in the way it deserved, the document named her, and the council had accepted it as evidentiary, and the morning session would proceed on that basis regardless of what Kaelin assembled in the remaining hours. But Malrek's plan was a leverage mechanism, not an outcome. She had said this aloud, and it had registered in Thornwall's face before she was removed. The question was what Malrek intended to leverage toward, what he actually wanted from the position he had spent 20 years building. He did not want her crowned. She was certain of that. A crowned empress could be legitimized and educated and eventually become a genuine alternative power center. That was not useful to him. He did not want Kaelin dead. The living emperor leverage was his most valuable asset. He wanted, what? A signed agreement? A restructuring of the financial relationships between the throne and the chancellor's office? Something that made his position irremovable, his authority over the empire's financial architecture permanent and insulated from imperial review? Was possible. It was the most economically rational reading of the play. And if that was true, then she was not a political actor in this situation. She was a document, a piece of negotiating leverage that Malrek had assembled with 20 years of patience and that he would produce, threaten to activate, and then agree to shelve in exchange for whatever he actually wanted. Her existence was the price of a deal she was not party to. The window's early light was beginning to shift. Not dawn yet, but the precursor to it. The particular blue-gray that arrives an hour before the sun commits to the sky. Somewhere in the palace, Kaelin was moving through the remaining hours, trying to assemble something that could hold against a structure built over 2 decades by the smartest financial mind in the empire. Somewhere in the palace, Cien and Austin were in custody and had information that was either going to matter enormously or was going to arrive too late. And somewhere, she did not know where, there were 12 faces from the preparation chamber, 11 of whom were not yet in custody, any one of whom might have the specific piece of connective knowledge that unraveled the constructed narrative. She stood. She went to the window. The interior courtyard below was beginning to show movement. The earliest palace staff, the ones who started before dawn to have the heating fires, and the breakfast preparations completed before the residential wing woke. Servants moving through the familiar choreography of invisible labor. She watched them, and she thought about 11 days of memorizing routes. And she thought about what she knew about this building that the people currently deciding her fate did not think to account for. The door opened without a knock. She turned. It was not a guard. It was Lord Vecht. He was alone, which was the first thing wrong. A council lord does not visit a holding suite alone. The absence of attendants meant the absence of witnesses, which meant this was not a visit that Vecht intended to have recorded in any account of the morning's proceedings. He closed the door behind him. She did not move from the window. "You're smarter than the Chancellor expected," Vecht said. He had the tone of a man offering a compliment as an opening position in a negotiation. The leverage argument. He didn't anticipate someone making it that clearly, that fast. She said nothing. "It won't change the vote," he said. "Thornwall is resistant but not committed. Edenmere will follow whoever seems to have the stronger position by dawn. The motion passes." "Then why are you here?" she said. Vecht moved to the room's center. He was not a large man, but he had the practiced presence of someone who had spent a career learning how to fill spaces his physical size did not naturally occupy. "Because the Chancellor's plan has a flaw," he said. "And the flaw is that his leverage requires your cooperation." She looked at him. "If you claim the succession voluntarily," Vecht said, "the document becomes an active succession instrument rather than a threat. A threat that activates produces a crisis, but a voluntary claim produces a process, a formal succession inquiry that must be adjudicated by the full Alpha Council with all 7 houses, with proper evidentiary standards, with timeline requirements that extend well past any single morning session." She understood what he was describing. If she claimed the succession herself, Malrek lost control of the timing. The lever could not be selectively deployed if the person it was pointed at had already pulled it independently. "And during that process," Vecht continued, "the Emperor has the legal standing to challenge the documentation under formal evidentiary review, which is a process that takes months and that Malrek cannot accelerate." "And you," she said, "what do you get from this?" Vecht smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has been underestimated his entire career and has learned to use that as cover. "House Vecht has been on the wrong side of the Chancellor's financial arrangements for 11 years, he said. Specific trade obligations that were structured to disadvantage us while appearing neutral. I have documentation. I need a council that is willing to review it. The current council configuration is not willing because 3 of the houses present tonight have arrangements with the Chancellor's office that they would prefer remain unexamined. You want him removed, she said. I want him where his arrangements can be fully audited, Vecht said, which is the same thing, but slower and more permanent. She stood at the window and she thought about the specific architecture of this offer and what it required of her and what it meant about the situation she was standing in. Voluntary succession claim. The one action Malrek's plan had not accounted for, because it was the one action that made no rational sense for a woman who had spent 11 days as an invisible border province servant with no knowledge of imperial politics and no reason to want any of this, except that she was no longer that person. She was not sure exactly when that had changed, whether it was the goblets falling, or the dark corridor, or the archive in the middle of the night, or the moment Cienne had said her name in a room full of people who were deciding what to do with her existence. But the change had happened, and it could not be undone. And what she was now was someone who understood enough of the mechanism to operate inside it. The question was whether operating inside it was the same as being consumed by it. This was the thing that no one in this palace had asked her. Not Kaelin, who had been too busy calculating. Not Malrek, who had never thought of her as a participant. Not Vecht, who was offering her a tool without asking whether she wanted to be the hand that held it. Whether she wanted any of this. Whether the woman whose mother had spent 22 years as a laundress at a garrison because she could not go back to wherever she had been before, whether that woman's daughter wanted to walk into the center of an imperial succession crisis and become the mechanism by which a chancellor's 20-year plan was dismantled. She thought about her mother's face. She thought about the specific look her mother had used whenever she asked about her father. Not the absence of an answer, the active choice not to give one. The look of a woman who has decided that a particular truth is more dangerous than the silence around it, and has made her peace with the silence, and has built a life inside it, and has tried to give her daughter enough tools to survive without needing the truth that the silence was hiding. Notice everything. Say nothing. Become furniture. It was survival philosophy. She had always known that. She had not known until tonight that it was also protection. If I do this, she said, I need something first. Vecht waited. I need access to the garrison records, she said. The original ones. Not the copies in the succession document. The actual garrison physician's log from Westfall, 24 years ago. Why? Vecht said. Because, she said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady. If I'm going to stand in front of the Alpha Council and make a succession claim, I need to know whether I'm telling the truth. Vecht looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. I can get you to the records office, he said. It will take 20 minutes. Then we have time, she said. She moved toward the door and stopped. Because the door had already opened and it was not Vecht's exit she was walking toward. It was Malrek's entrance, and he was not alone. And the 2 men behind him wore the specific livery of the council's senior security detachment, and his expression when he saw Vecht standing in the holding suite carried the quality of a man who has just learned that his plan's flaw was larger than he thought and has decided to address it immediately. Lord Vecht, Malrek said. The name was a sentence by itself, an accusation wearing the shape of an address. Vecht's posture changed, not collapsing. He was too experienced for that. But she could see the calculation running behind his eyes at a speed that had the quality of desperation. The specific recalibration of a man who has been caught at the board with his pieces moved and his opponent's pieces where they should not be. Chancellor, Vecht said, I was ensuring the subject was being properly maintained pending the morning session. Of course, Malrek said. The 2 words contained everything they needed to contain. He looked at Alara, and she understood, in this moment, what the fracture in the room had cost her. The leverage argument she had made in the council chamber, the naming of the mechanism aloud in front of witnesses, had done what she had intended it to do. It had planted doubt in Thornwall, recalibrated Edenmere, and apparently accelerated whatever independent calculation Vecht had already been running. It had also told Malrek that she was not the border province servant the plan had assumed. She was someone who could read a political structure in real time and describe it accurately to a room full of people who were invested in not seeing it, which made her, not leverage, a threat. The guards moved past Malrek into the room. Not toward Vecht, toward her. Different movement than before. The earlier guards had been executing a formal process. These moved with the specific quality of men who have been given instructions that would not appear in any official record of the morning's proceedings. Vecht said, "Chancellor, I must protest." "You will protest in the chamber," Malrek said, "at the appropriate time, through the appropriate process." She had 4 seconds, she calculated. 4 seconds before the guards reached her and the geometry of the room closed around any option she had not yet taken. She took the only one available. She went through the window. The interior courtyard was 20 feet below. She knew this because she had looked at it for the last 40 minutes and measured it in the instinctive way that she measured everything in every room she occupied. 20 feet onto cobblestone was not survivable at a full fall, but the interior courtyard had a secondary roofline. The kitchen extension, 4 feet below the windowsill and 6 feet to the left, that she had noted because she noted things like that, because her mother had taught her to know her exits before she needed them, because the furniture did not get to choose when the room changed around it, and so it learned to know where the doors were. She hit the kitchen roof hard enough to feel it in her knees and her palms. She did not stop moving. Below her in the holding suite, she heard Malrek say, with the particular calm of a man who has just confirmed his revised assessment of a situation, "Find her, quietly." The courtyard was filling with the early morning staff. She dropped from the kitchen roof to the service path between the kitchen exterior and the inner garden wall, and she straightened and she breathed and she looked at the courtyard geometry. 12 years of being invisible. 11 days of memorizing routes. She walked. She did not run. Running was visible. She walked with the directional confidence of someone who belonged in this space doing something that needed doing, and she moved through the courtyard's early morning choreography without drawing a single eye. She needed to reach Kaelin before Malrek's quiet search did. She had, she calculated from the light, perhaps 2 hours before the morning session. She had the knowledge she had gathered. She had the architecture of the trap. She had Vecht's information, half given, about the financial documentation that could dismantle the Chancellor's position if the Council was configured to receive it. What she did not have was what she had asked Vecht for. The garrison records. The truth. And as she moved through the palace's early morning shadows toward the corridor, she had memorized on her 4th day of carrying trays. She made a decision she had not known she was going to make until the moment it was already made. She would not claim the succession without knowing whether the claim was true, even if it was the only tactical move available, even if it cost her the window Vecht had described. Even if Malrek reached her before she reached the records and the 2 remaining hours collapsed into something she could not navigate. Because there was a specific line she understood now, having spent a night inside the machinery of an empire that treated truth as a negotiable resource. A specific line between being used by a lie and choosing to carry one. And she was not yet certain which side of that line she was on. But she was about to find out, and when she found out, everything that came next would be decided by a woman who knew what she was standing on. Not a border province servant, not a political instrument, not a document in a 47-page succession case. Something that none of them had planned for. Someone who had chosen. She found the garrison records in 23 minutes. The Westfall Border Registry maintained a satellite filing office in the palace's administrative wing. She had learned this on her 9th day, carrying a misdirected document bundle that had taken her past a door marked with the provincial registry seal before a senior steward redirected her. The office was unstaffed at this hour. The lock was the standard provincial iron latch, the same mechanism used throughout the service infrastructure, not the dual-key institutional locks of the main archive. She had it open in 4 seconds, with the thin iron pin she had taken from the kitchen roof's drainage channel when she landed. The garrison physician's logs were filed chronologically in the secondary cabinet, the way provincial records always were, organized for retrieval rather than security, because no one had ever considered them worth securing. She found the correct year in the 3rd drawer, found the correct month, found the entry. She read it standing in the gray pre-dawn light coming through the office's single east-facing window, without sitting down, because some information you receive standing. The entry was 8 lines. Garrison physician's handwriting, the compressed, efficient script of a man recording facts rather than constructing a narrative. Date: patient, presenting condition, assessment, disposition. The patient's name was not her mother's name. It was close, similar enough that a forger working from partial information could have made the substitution and had it hold up under casual review. But it was not her mother's name. The specific combination of given name and provincial surname was two characters different in the given name, a difference that was invisible in the summary documents Malrek's people had constructed but present and clear in the original. She stood with the log open in her hands, and she thought about what this meant. The document was built on a genuine record that had been attributed to the wrong woman. Her mother had been at that garrison. She was in the census records. She was in the labor registry. She was documented as a laundress through the period in question. But the physician's entry was someone else's. The pregnancy, the transfer request, the managed exit, that belonged to another woman, a different border province servant whose name was close enough to her mother's that the substitution had been made and the connective narrative built over it. The succession claim was false. Not in the technical sense that forged documents were false, in the fundamental sense that she was not who the document said she was. She closed the log. She held it for a moment, and then she did something she had not known she was going to do until she did it. She took the log with her. Not as evidence exactly, as something more personal than evidence, the record of what her mother had not been, which was in its way also the record of what her mother had chosen to remain. A laundress. A woman who taught her daughter to notice everything and say nothing. A woman who had built a life inside silence that turned out not to be about shame, but about distance. The specific distance between a woman and the proximity of dangerous men who were looking for something close to her and could not be allowed to find it. She understood now why her mother had taught her to become furniture. You hide what matters inside something invisible. She came out of the records office, back into the administrative corridor, and she moved. She found Kaylin in the war room. She knew it was the war room because the palace's war room was the only chamber on the inner residential level, with a permanently staffed guard position at both entrance points, and because the sound coming through the door had the quality of multiple voices speaking simultaneously in the specific register of controlled urgency that occurs when people who are trained to manage crises are managing one that is larger than their training anticipated. The guard at the door recognized her from the night's proceedings and hesitated, the hesitation of a man trying to calculate whether letting her through was within his current authority. "Step aside," she said, with the specific quality of a voice that has decided it is done asking. He stepped aside. The war room was built for this. Maps on 3 walls, current and detailed, with markers that had been repositioned in the last hour by hands she could see still moving. 2 military adjutants updating positions, pulling information from dispatches that were arriving at a pace that told her the situation outside the palace was developing faster than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Kaylin was at the central table. He was not alone. Lord Thornwall stood to his left. 2 senior guard commanders, the palace's head of military intelligence, a compact woman named Reth, whom Alara had seen exactly once in 11 days, briefly, at a distance, and had noted with the particular attention she gave to people who moved through spaces as if they had already memorized the exits. He saw her come through the door, and something in his posture changed. Not relief. She filed the word away and looked for a more accurate one. Recognition. The specific quality of a man who has been operating at high capacity for several hours and has just been handed a piece of information he had not known he was waiting for. "The record is wrong," she said, and crossed to the table and set the garrison log in front of him. The physician's entry was attributed to the wrong woman. The surname was altered by 2 characters. The original is here. He looked at it. Thornwall looked at it. "The document names a woman who was at the garrison during the period in question," she said. "But who is not my mother? The connective record was built on a substitution. The original disproves the lineage." Kaylin picked up the log. He read the entry. He set it down. "Can it be authenticated?" Thornwall said. "Not hostile. The question of a man who is trying to help and needs to understand the tool's limitations." "The garrison seal's on every page," she said. "The handwriting is consistent with the surrounding entries. It's not a separate insertion. It's continuous with the log's existing record." "Malrek's people would have had to access the original to make the substitution," Kaylin said. "Yes," she said, "which means someone in the provincial registry gave them access. which is a separate thread, but it means the original record is clean because they didn't alter it. They copied it and altered the copy. Thornwall looked at Kalen. It's enough, Kalen said. With the amendment analysis and the vile evidence in this, it's enough to request a full council review rather than a morning session summary vote. Malrek will contest the authentication, Thornwall said. He'll contest it in a full review process that takes months and requires all 7 houses, Kalen said, which is exactly where he doesn't want to be. She had said this to Vecht in the holding suite, what felt like several hours ago. The irony of arriving at the same position through a completely different route was not lost on her. Vecht had offered her the voluntary claim as a tactical instrument. She had refused to use the claim without knowing whether it was true. And the truth had turned out to be the better weapon. Truth generally was. The problem was it required more time to locate than a useful lie. The session opens in 90 minutes, the military intelligence head said. Her voice was the measured, specific quality of a woman who dealt in facts and wanted everyone else to deal in the same currency. We have the garrison log and the amendment analysis. We need the vial authenticated by the palace physician. Physician's report was completed 40 minutes ago, said one of the guard commanders. Compound consistent with a Class 2 contact poison. Concentrated enough to be fatal within 4 hours of consumption with no visible initial onset. Deliverable through direct contact with the cup's interior. Malrek's second verification is himself, Alara said. Under Article 17, the succession claim requires his testimony. Without it, the document is incomplete. If we can remove his ability to testify, we cannot simply remove a chancellor from his position on the morning of an active council session, Thornwall said. The statement was not a refusal. It was a description of the political physics involved. No, Kalen said. But we can charge him. The room registered this. Charging the Chancellor of Valdoran with conspiracy to commit assassination on the morning of an Imperial Summit Council session with 6 of the 7 Alpha Lords present or represented. This was not a standard prosecution. It was a political detonation. It would create a crisis regardless of the evidence. It would fracture alliances that had existed for years. It would change the shape of the Empire's internal architecture in ways that could not be fully predicted and would take years to resolve. It was also, she understood, the only move that created the necessary pressure in the necessary time frame. Power at its most fundamental is not about who holds the most force. It is about who makes the other party believe that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. Malrek's entire plan had been built on making Kalen believe that the succession crisis was an uncontrollable variable, something to be managed through accommodation rather than contested through confrontation. The evidence they had assembled did not merely disprove the claim. It reframed the entire night's events as a criminal conspiracy with a documented chain from the poison in the cup to the forged records to the 20-year pattern of financial manipulation that Vecht had referenced. He'll argue political prosecution, Thornwall said. Let him argue it, Kalen said, in front of all 7 houses, with the vial on the table and the garrison log next to it and Austin and Cien available to testify about the preparation chamber. She watched him. This was the thing about watching someone operate under extreme pressure over the course of a long night. You stopped seeing the performance of authority and started seeing the actual mechanism. What Kalen was doing in this war room was not the work of a man protecting his throne. It was the work of a man who had decided that protecting the throne the wrong way would cost more than it preserved. He could have used the succession document as a counter-instrument, the way Vecht had suggested. He could have absorbed the claim and made her into a political symbol and managed Malrek through the slow institutional process of embedding a rival power center in his own court. He had not done that. He had gone after the evidence instead, after the truth of it. And she understood that this was not strategy alone, lag. Strategy would have accepted the more convenient option. This was something more specific. The conviction of a man who had spent 9 years ruling an empire and had arrived at the understanding that power built on a manageable lie is always more expensive than power built on a difficult truth. The session, she said. I need to be in it. Absolutely not, the guard commander said. The succession document names me, she said. I have standing to appear. And I have the garrison log, which I retrieved personally from the provincial records office, which gives me first-hand evidentiary standing that a secondary introduction cannot replicate. Kalen looked at her. If Malrek sees you walk into that chamber, he said, He will know the holding suite is empty and that whatever Vec told you did or did not produce a voluntary claim. He already knows the holding suite is empty, she said. He sent people to find me quietly 20 minutes after I left through the window. He knows I'm gone. The only question he doesn't have answered is what I found. A short silence. Then we give him the answer publicly, Kaelin said. The council chamber at the first full light of morning looked different than it had in the pre-dawn configuration of the emergency session. The formal torches were lit, all of them, the complete ceremonial array that the protocol required for official business. The Alpha Lords were in their designated seats. The Chancellor's position was at the head of the secondary table, to the right of the Emperor's chair. Malrek was already there when they entered. She walked in 3 steps behind Kaelin, to his left and slightly behind. Not the position of a prisoner, not the position of a guard. The position of a person who had been asked to be present and had agreed to it and was present on those terms. The chamber registered their entrance in the specific way that rooms register information that changes the expected configuration of an event. Heads turned. Positions shifted. She watched the chain of recognition move around the table. Thornwall, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose resistance the previous night had turned out to be correctly placed. Vect, with the complicated expression of someone who had provided partial assistance and was now calculating whether that would be remembered favorably or used against him. Edenmir's representative, with the look of someone who had been uncertain and was now grateful to have not committed. And Malrek. His face showed nothing for approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she watched him process her presence, her posture, the garrison log under her arm, Kaelin's forward movement to the Emperor's position, the alignment of Thornwall and Reth, and the guard commanders filling the room's perimeter. She watched him run the calculation. He was very fast, she gave him that. The 3 seconds ended and his expression settled into something that looked like composure but had, if you had spent several hours learning to read the difference, the texture of a man who has accepted that the board has changed and is now playing a different game with the same face. "The council is assembled," the session master announced. The formal words. The beginning of the institutional process. Kaelin sat. He waited 3 beats. The specific pause of a man who has learned that the person who speaks first in a room they need to control has to mean it. "Before the Chancellor's motion is addressed," Kaelin said, "the council will hear new evidence relevant to the matter." Malrek said, "The session protocol requires—" "The session protocol is mine to convene and mine to order," Kaelin said. Article 3, Charter Foundation. "The Emperor's session authority in a matter of imperial succession is primary." He looked at Malrek. "You wrote Article 17. I trust you've read 3. Something moved through the room. Not sound, the absence of it. The specific silence of a chamber full of powerful people suddenly paying attention in a different way than they had been a moment before. She set the garrison log on the table. The succession document introduced by the Chancellor names a specific lineage through a Westfall garrison physician's record, she said. The original record was accessed and partially altered. The original, unaltered entry names a different individual than the one in the succession claim. The surnames differ by 2 characters in the given name. I retrieved the original log from the Provincial Records Office this morning. She pushed it toward the center of the table. "The council may examine it," she said. "The garrison seal is on every page. The entry is continuous with the surrounding log. It is not a separate insertion. The original record does not support the lineage claim." Malrek said, "The provincial record's provenance requires authentication by a certified archivist." "Agreed," Kaelin said. "And while the council's archivists perform that authentication, they will also examine the amendment registered under Article 17 in the 14th year of the current reign, the full text of which establishes the Chancellor's office as the sole secondary verification authority for succession claims, a provision that does not appear in any succession law prior to that amendment, and that creates a conflict of interest the Council has not previously reviewed." Lord Thornwall said, "I move to expand the scope of this session to include a full review of the succession claim's evidentiary basis prior to any vote." Edenmir's representative said, "Seconded." Malrek's posture did not change, but his hands, flat on the table in front of him with the deliberate quality of a man who has positioned them there intentionally, moved. The smallest adjustment, a shift of weight from the fingertips to the palm. She filed it. The motion requires a majority, the session master said. The vote ran around the table. Thornwall, Edenmere, the Greymantle representative, Ironfall's lord, who had said nothing all morning and voted with the motion in the specific way of someone who has been waiting to see which direction the room's weight was falling. 4. Against Vecht, who paused long enough to produce a significant silence before voting with the motion, which he interpreted as a man managing the optics of appearing principled rather than tactical, and Blackfin's lord, who voted against. 5-1, with Caldrus unrepresented. The motion passed. The session master announced a 2-hour adjournment for the archivists to begin their review, and Malrek stood. She expected him to leave. He did not leave. He stood at the secondary table's head, and he looked at Kaelin with the expression she had last seen in fragments, now assembled, complete, the face beneath the 20-year performance. Not the composed chancellor, the actual man, the one who had spent 2 decades believing that patience and architecture were sufficient, that if you built the trap carefully enough and waited long enough, the trap would activate on its own terms. You understand, Malrek said, that this changes nothing material. The room was still. The financial obligations of 8 border territories, he said, do not dissolve because a council vote goes the wrong direction. The debt instruments I hold are legal documents signed by legitimate representatives of their respective houses. An audit of my office produces records. It does not produce forgiveness. He was not speaking to Kaelin. He was speaking to the room. Every lord in this chamber, he said, has an obligation that runs through instruments managed by the Chancellor's office. That does not change today. It does not change next month. It does not change if the succession claim is withdrawn and the document is burned, and every person who was in the preparation chamber last night testifies against me in open council. He paused. What changes is the price I charge for my discretion. That price was previously negotiable. It is about to become significantly less so. The silence after was a different quality than any of the morning's previous silences. This was what 20 years looked like from the inside. Not a plot, a system. And the system was not housed in the succession document or the forged record or the conspiracy to stage a failed assassination. It was housed in the paper, in the legal instruments, the signed obligations, the financial architecture of an empire that had been built through conquest and maintained through debt. She looked at the lords around the table. She saw, in their faces, the specific expression of people who had just been reminded that they were not spectators to this situation. They were participants, had been participants for years, without fully understanding the nature of their participation. This was the most sophisticated thing Malrek had done, not the assassination, not the succession claim. This, the public declaration, in front of witnesses, of the mechanism of his actual power. Because if the lords in this room went home knowing that their financial obligations ran through a man who was willing to name that leverage in open council, they had a choice to make. They could align against him and accept the cost of having those obligations called, or they could recalculate. And enough of them, he was betting, would recalculate. Kaelin stood. She had been watching him for the duration of Malrek's speech, in the same way she had watched him all night, reading the architecture of what was happening beneath the controlled surface. She saw him make the decision before he spoke. She saw it in the quality of his stillness, which was different from the thinking stillness she had learned. This was the stillness of a man on the far side of a decision, standing in the moment after it has been made, before the action that follows it. Every obligation you hold, Kaelin said, is an obligation to the Empire, not to your office. The instruments are signed by the Empire's representatives and are managed by the Chancellor's office on behalf of the Crown. Malrek looked at him. The Crown can transfer that management, Kaelin said, immediately, to the Imperial Treasury, which operates under direct Imperial authority. The instruments remain valid. The obligations remain valid. What changes is who manages them. The specific quality of the silence told her this was not something Malrek had fully accounted for. He had built his leverage on the assumption that the financial instruments were de facto his, that the institutional inertia of 20 years would make the theoretical distinction between his management and the Crown's ownership too slow to weaponize in a single morning. You cannot execute a treasury transfer without council approval, Malrek said. Article 8, Kaelin said, Imperial financial authority in a declared crisis. A failed assassination attempt and an active succession investigation constitute a declared crisis under the Charter's definition. You have not formally declared. I'm declaring it now, Kalin said, in front of the council, with the record of last night's events documented in the session transcript. He looked at the session master. Note it. The session master noted it. Malrek stood very still for 3 full seconds. She understood what was happening in those seconds. She had watched him run calculations all night, quickly, efficiently, with the specific speed of a mind that had spent decades operating at the intersection of legal architecture and political timing. But this calculation was different from the others because this one did not have a clean answer. The transfer was legal. The crisis declaration was legal. The council could contest both, but contesting them required the same council vote that had just gone against Malrek 5-1, and the financial leverage he had just named in open council had, in the act of naming it, made every lord in the room aware that their interests and his were not aligned. A leverage mechanism named in public becomes a shared problem. This was the thing about power exercised through darkness. It required the darkness to function. Malrek had chosen to name his leverage because he had believed the room was still dark enough to absorb it. He had miscalculated the light. Take him, Kalin said. The guard commanders moved. Malrek did not fight it. That was the most revealing moment of the entire morning. The absence of physical resistance from a man who had spent 20 years building an architecture of control. He stood, and he let the guards take his arms, and he looked at Kalin with the expression of a man filing away information for use at a later date, still calculating, still operating on the assumption that this was not an ending but a transition. Perhaps it was. She did not know yet. She watched them take them through the chamber's door, and she breathed, and she catalogued the room's response. Thornwall, with the face of a man who had been carrying a suspicion for years and has now had it confirmed. Edenmere's representative, with the look of someone who had voted correctly by accident and was grateful for the accident. Vecht, with the careful expression of a man who had provided useful assistance and was now waiting to see how the ledger would be resolved. Blackfin's lord, who had voted against the motion, was looking at the door through which Malrek had just been escorted and had the particular expression of a man who was performing a rapid and not entirely comfortable reassessment of his morning's choices. She looked at Kalin. He was looking at her. Ekit. The adjournment was 2 hours. She spent 40 minutes of it in the military intelligence office with Reth and 2 senior analysts, walking through the preparation chamber sequence again. Not from memory this time, but from the documentation that Austin's and Cien's combined testimonies had produced in the 3 hours since their detentions. The 12 faces she had identified cross-referenced against the palace staff registry and the summit attendees list. 9 confirmed identifications within the first hour of the analysis. 2 more probable within the second. The 12th face remained unmatched. She described it again for the 3rd time. The specific quality of it. The positioning she had observed in the preparation chamber, the movement she had noted near the secondary serving trays where Cien had been working. Reth said, "You're describing someone who wasn't on any registered list." "Yes," she said. "Access to the preparation chamber without registry documentation means either a forged credential or a permanent staff position that predates the current access protocols." "How far back do the current protocols go?" she said. Reth looked at one of the analysts. The analyst checked something. 14 years, he said. 14 years. 1 year before Malrek had begun the formal construction of the succession document based on the timeline Cien had provided. Someone with access that predated the current protocols was someone who had been embedded before the infrastructure to detect them was in place. "Someone who has been here longer than the safeguards," Reth said. Her voice was flat with the specific flatness of a professional who has just identified the boundary of what she currently knows and is marking it clearly rather than filling it with assumption. "Yes," Alara said. Reth made a note. The 12th face remained open. She left the intelligence office and walked back through the residential corridor toward the outer chamber where the council session would reconvene. The palace around her had the quality of a building that has absorbed a significant event and is still processing it. Staff moving with the particular heightened purposefulness of people who know something large has happened but do not know the full shape of it. Guards repositioned at intervals that told her the security reconfiguration was already underway. She was passing the junction between the residential corridor and the eastern passage when she heard it. Not footsteps this time. A voice. Specifically, her name in the voice of the 12th face. She stopped. She turned slowly. The eastern passage was empty. She was certain she had heard it, the specific quality of a voice that has been trained to carry across distance without volume. The voice of someone who has spent years in service environments learning to communicate at the exact threshold between audible and undetectable. She stepped into the eastern passage. Nothing. The passage ran 40 feet to a junction, then branched toward the outer kitchen complex on the left and the residential staff quarters on the right. Both branches were empty at this distance. Both were dim. The torches in this section were not on the full summit configuration, the secondary lighting that the service staff used for their own passage. She moved toward the junction. She heard the voice again. Still her name. From the right branch. Residential staff quarters. She should go back. She understood this clearly. She should go back to the outer chamber and find Kaelin or Reth and report what she was hearing and let the trained personnel handle the 12th face she could not identify while she sat in a room with guards around her and waited for the council session to reconvene. She understood this. She was already moving right. There's a specific failure mode in people who have spent their lives operating through observation rather than authority. The moment when the habit of moving toward information instead of away from it becomes faster than the rational calculation of whether moving toward it is wise. She had spent 11 days in this palace running on that habit. She had spent the entire night running on it. It had produced every useful thing she had done. It was also how you got killed. The residential staff quarters were a long, narrow hall with bunk-style rooms on both sides, permanently occupied by the senior domestic staff, who lived in the palace rather than commuting from the city. Most rooms were empty at this hour. The staff was working. A few doors stood open. A few showed the signs of recent occupancy, unmade beds and the domestic detritus of people who lived in institutional space and had not yet had time to perform order this morning. The last room on the right was closed. She stood in front of it. She put her hand on the latch. She heard from inside the very specific sound of someone preparing to not be in the room they were currently in. The fast, quiet, purposeful movement of a person organizing their exit. She opened the door. The 12th face was there. She had been right about the age, mid-50s, the lines of someone who had worked indoors in service positions for most of those years. The small bag. The same style of doubled knot closure that Sienna's evidence bag had used. The window already open. Their eyes met. "Don't," Alara said. The 12th face looked at her with the specific expression of someone calculating whether the person in the doorway was a genuine obstacle or a manageable one. She was in servant livery. No weapon visible. No guard behind her. The doorway was the only exit except the window. And the window was open and the distance to the courtyard below was probably survivable with the right landing. She watched the calculation run. "The garrison record has already been presented to the council," she said. "The succession claim is under formal review. Malrek has been taken into custody. Whatever you're carrying in that bag is evidence in an active investigation. And if you go through that window, you spend the rest of your life as a fugitive in an empire that now has every political reason to find you." The 12th face did not move toward the window, but did not move toward her either. Or, she said, "You tell me who sent you into that preparation chamber 14 years before the current access protocols were in place. And you tell me what you've been doing in this palace since then, and you tell me who else is in this building that I haven't identified yet." She paused. "And we have a conversation about what that information is worth." The 12th face looked at her for a long time. "You're the border province girl," the 12th face said. The voice was low and specifically gendered. A woman, she understood now. The voice she had heard in the corridor had the quality of a woman who had worked for decades in the habit of making herself sound less female, less distinctive, less identifiable. "I am," she said. "They built a whole empire's worth of trouble on your mother's name." "Close to her name," Alara said. "They got it wrong." Something moved in the 12th face's expression. Something old and tired and with the specific texture of a person who has been inside a system for too long and has arrived at the complicated place beyond loyalty and before whatever comes after it. "There are 3 others," the 12th face said, "in the palace. They're not in the preparation chamber anymore. After Varric fell, they were told to sit dormant and wait." "Wait for what?" she said. "For the signal that the session had gone the right direction. If the succession vote passed, they were to move to the secondary phase. She felt the cold arrive again. The same cold as when she had stood in the archive and understood that the problem she was inside was larger than she had thought. "What is the secondary phase?" she said. The 12th face looked at the bag, then at her. "If the political mechanism failed," she said, "Malrek's contingency was physical. He needed the Emperor dead after all, just differently timed than the original plan. And the secondary phase was designed to look like a response to the political chaos rather than the cause of it." The palace around her suddenly felt different. The sounds she had been half-registering, the movement of staff, the repositioned guards, the general controlled urgency of a building managing a crisis, reorganized themselves in her perception. 3 others, dormant, waiting for a signal. The signal had not come from the session because the session had not gone the right direction, but the signal could come from somewhere else. Someone else. Someone who was not Malrek, but who had the authority within the network to activate the secondary phase now that the primary one had failed. The 12th face. She looked at the bag. "The bag," she said. The 12th face's posture changed. 1 degree. The specific degree of change that occurs in a person's body when they have been found out and their body knows it before their face commits to acknowledging it. "Give me the bag," she said. The 12th face gave her the bag. She opened it with hands that she would not allow to shake. Inside was a small, sealed letter, the same format as the letter that had fallen from Austin's coat in the council room hours ago. Same paper, same double seal. Her name was not on it. The Emperor's name was not on it. A symbol. The Ashbourne crest, but inverted. The Ashbourne crest inverted and placed over a single letter. The letter in the old imperial script that she had seen once in a document the archive staff had been refiling on her 3rd day in this palace. Not Malrek's mark. A different mark entirely. Her mind assembled the knight's pieces in a new configuration, and the new configuration was worse than the previous one. Malrek had not been the architect. Or rather, Malrek had been one architect. The financial architecture, the legal architecture, the 20-year patience. But the secondary phase, the contingency, the physical mechanism that was currently dormant in 3 places in this building, that was not his. The inverted crest belonged to a different hand, a hand that had been working parallel to Malrek's, a hand that had let Malrek's plan run because Malrek's plan was useful cover and because the secondary phase was always the real objective: kill the Emperor. In the chaos of a failed political coup, with 3 nations' worth of alpha lords in the building and the succession in genuine crisis, and every guard in the palace operating on the assumption that the primary threat was the man already in custody. "Who sent you?" she said. The 12th face said a name. She felt the blood drop from her face. Because the name was not a chancellor's name, not a lord's name, not any name in the network of conspiracies she had been mapping all night. It was the name of a man who had been with Kaelin for 9 years, his most trusted general. The man who had been standing at the guard captain's shoulder when she had first crossed the council room threshold, early in the long hours before dawn, when this night was still young enough that she had not understood what she was standing inside. The man who was, at this moment, part of the Emperor's inner security contingent for the council session reconvening in 23 minutes. She ran. The corridor from the residential staff quarters to the council chamber outer hall was 300 feet when you took the direct route through the residential wing's main passage. She took it at a dead run, which was not the movement of a person who belonged in a palace corridor, but was the movement of a person who had run out of the time and energy to manage other people's perceptions of her. Servants flattened against walls. A steward dropped his document stack. A guard at the residential wing's interior junction started to reach for her, and she said, "The Emperor," in the voice that her mother had taught her to reserve for situations that did not permit negotiation, and kept running. She hit the outer hall at full speed, and the 2 guards at the council chamber entrance were already raising their hands in the universal gesture of someone about to stop an unauthorized person when she said the general's name. Both of them froze for the wrong reason. The wrong reason was that the general's name was the name of authority, was the name that cleared rooms and opened doors and produced compliance from people whose job was to refuse compliance. She had just invoked the most trusted man in Kaelin's inner circle as a reason to enter a secure chamber. She understood, in the half-second of their hesitation, that this was the trap. that the name worked in both directions, that the general's position meant that naming him was as likely to get her stopped as permitted. She went through anyway. The council chamber, the formal configuration, the session master preparing to call the reconvening, the lords at their positions, the chancellor's empty position, which had the specific emptiness of a space that still carried presence, even in the absence of its occupant. Kalin at the emperor's chair. The general standing 3 feet to his left, slightly behind, in the precise position of the most trusted guard. She came through the door at a run, and every head in the room turned, and Kalin rose, and the general's hand went to his sword, and she said, across the chamber, loud enough that the stone walls would carry it to every ear present, "Get away from him!" The general looked at her. His hand was still on the sword, and she watched his face in the moment that followed, the moment where a man who has been running a secondary architecture of betrayal alongside a primary architecture of loyalty has to make the last calculation, the one where the cover is finally, irrevocably gone. He made it. He made it in the wrong direction. The sword cleared the scabbard, and the chamber detonated, and Kalin moved, and the world collapsed into the specific chaos of a room full of people responding to a blade at the proximity of an emperor. And somewhere in the palace walls, 3 other people were receiving a signal they had been waiting for. And the night that had started with 2 identical goblets and an accidental switch was arriving at the moment it had been building toward since before she had ever walked through the palace gates. The moment where everything balanced on the edge of a single choice, and the choice had not yet been made. The sword cleared the scabbard in the specific arc of a man who had practiced the movement 10,000 times and had stopped thinking about it and had started simply doing it, and the chamber's response was not a single thing, but a cascade. Guards moving from 3 positions simultaneously, lords dropping from their seats, the session master's ceremonial staff clattering against the stone floor as the man holding it chose to prioritize his body over his protocol. Kalin moved left, not back. Left. Away from the blade's natural follow-through into the geometry where the general's momentum would carry the sword past him if the general committed to the initial line. The general did not commit. He was too experienced for that. He pulled the stroke and repositioned, and the 2 of them were suddenly in the specific spatial relationship of 2 men who have trained together for 9 years and therefore know each other's fighting architecture the way they know their own. That knowledge worked in both directions. Alara was still moving, the chamber door behind her, the distance to the emperor's position, the general between her and Kalin, which was the correct position for a man whose stated function was protection and whose actual function was the opposite. Because the most dangerous betrayal is always the one that wears the correct uniform. She had nothing that qualified as a weapon. She had the letter from the 12th Face's bag still in her hand, which was paper and therefore useless in the immediate physics of the situation. She had 11 days of palace geometry and 1 night of understanding how power actually moved through rooms. She threw the letter. Not at the general. At Kalin. He caught it without breaking his movement pattern. The automatic reach of a man who had learned to process information from multiple directions simultaneously because the alternative in his position was fatal. He caught it, registered it was a letter, registered the inverted crest seal, and something happened in his face that was not the controlled quality she had learned to read all night. It was recognition, not of the general's betrayal. He was already operating on that knowledge. He had moved correctly too fast for it to have been a surprise. Recognition of something else. Something the inverted crest told him that she did not yet have the full context to understand. 2 of the chamber guards reached the general from behind. He took one of them across the jaw with his elbow, a movement so automatic it happened while his eyes were still on Kalin. And the guard went down hard, and the second guard grabbed the general's sword arm, and the 3 of them collapsed into the brutal close-quarters work of trained men fighting in a space too small for the weapons involved. The secondary positions, Kalin said. Not to her. To the guard commander at the chamber's far wall who had his own sword out and was reading the situation with the specific quality of a man waiting for the correct instruction before he committed to a direction. 3 of them, still dormant, building interior. The guard commander moved. He was speaking into the communication chain that ran through the guard's interconnected positions before he was fully through the door. She looked at Kalin. "Who is it?" she said. The inverted crest. The secondary architecture, the parallel plan that had been running alongside Malrex for an unknown period, possibly longer, possibly deeper. He looked at her across the chaos of the chamber. The lords repositioning, the general still fighting two guards, the session master having abandoned his protocol entirely in favor of the wall, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man who has spent 9 years trusting something that turned out to be constructed, and who is in the process of absorbing what that cost. House Blackfin, he said. She thought about the Blackfin contingent moving their lord behind 4 guards in under 4 seconds when Varric had fallen. She thought about Blackfin voting against the review motion. She thought about the Eastern Barracks cavalry, positioned at the 3rd marker, waiting for a signal from inside the palace. Not waiting for Malrec's signal, waiting for the generals. The chamber guard got the general's sword arm down, and a second guard put weight on his back, and it was over. The specific ending of a physical confrontation when one side runs out of the capacity to continue. The general hit the chamber floor with the sound of a man who is too experienced to waste energy on a resistance that has already failed. He lay still. He looked at Kaelin. 9 years, Kaelin said. His voice was not loud. In the sudden relative quiet of the chamber after the struggle, it did not need to be. The general said nothing. I want to understand, Kaelin said, which part of it was real. The question landed in the room differently than anything else that had been said in it. All night, all the speeches, all the accusations, all the maneuvering had been about what people had done. This was the only question anyone had asked about what they had felt. The general looked at the floor, then at Kaelin. His face had the quality of a man who has set down something he has been carrying for years and is now experiencing the strange weightlessness on the other side of it. Most of it, he said, until it wasn't. Kaelin held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Take him," and turned away. And she understood from the quality of his turning that this was not coldness. It was the specific controlled movement of a man who knows that if he stays in the weight of that moment any longer, he will not be able to do what the next hours require. There are losses that cannot be processed in real time. You carry them forward and find the space for them later, when the building is no longer on fire. The 3 secondary positions were neutralized within 40 minutes, not without cost. One guard took a blade in the shoulder in the corridor outside the residential wing. He would survive, the physician said, but the shoulder would carry the accounting of this night for the rest of his life, in the specific way that bodies carry the decisions of powerful men. The Blackfin cavalry at the Eastern Barracks received no signal. They waited through the morning and into the early afternoon before their lord's representative, now under council detention, sent a formal withdrawal message through the official diplomatic channels, the message of a house that has calculated the cost of continuing a commitment whose primary architect is no longer in a position to protect them from the consequences. The Eastern cavalry turned around. She watched them go from the war room window, Reth beside her, both of them silent for a moment with the particular silence of people who have been operating at high intensity for many hours and have arrived at the first moment where the intensity is no longer immediately required, and the body does not quite know what to do with the absence. "The 12th face," Reth said. "Still in the staff quarters," Alara said. "She stayed." "You left her there." "She gave me the letter," she said. "She gave me the general's name. She stayed when she could have run." She paused. "She's been inside Malrec's network for 14 years. She knows more about the financial architecture than any document will show us. She's worth more as a source than as a prosecution." Reth looked at her with the evaluating quality of a professional who is deciding whether the judgment she is hearing is naive or correct. "I'll interview her," Reth said. "Yes," she said. She turned from the window. The full council session reconvened at midday, with all 7 houses present, Caldress represented by their lord's senior advisor, the lord himself still in the physician's wing, but recovering, the poison's timeline extended by his body's particular stubbornness in the way of men who have survived campaigns and refused the lesson. The garrison log was authenticated in 3 hours by the palace archivist, and 2 independent provincial record specialists summoned from the city. The authentication was not dramatic. It was methodical. Comparative analysis, seal verification, handwriting consistency. The quiet, thorough work of people establishing a fact rather than constructing a narrative, which was slower than construction and considerably harder to reverse. The succession claim was formally withdrawn from council consideration. Not dismissed, withdrawn. The distinction mattered. Dismissal created a record of a failed claim. Withdrawal created a record of an evidentiary failure in the process, which was a different kind of political document and one that named the Chancellor's office specifically as the site of the failure. Malric's formal charges were read into the council record. Conspiracy to commit assassination. Fraudulent construction of succession documentation. Abuse of the Chancellor's financial authority. The list was longer than she had expected. Reth's team had moved quickly through the morning, and the financial architecture that Vecht had referenced turned out to be more extensive and more explicitly criminal than even its most cynical observers had calculated. 20 years. Built carefully. Exposed in a single night by a woman who caught 2 falling goblets and set them back in the wrong order. She sat through the full session in a chair at the table's edge. Not at the table, not excluded from it. The specific position of someone who has been acknowledged without being assigned a role, which was a political statement of its own kind, and one she suspected Kaelin had chosen deliberately. When the session ended and the lords dispersed into the corridors that would carry their dispatches and their analysis and their recalibrated positions back to their territories, she remained. The chamber emptied slowly. Thornwall paused at the door and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has something to say and has decided it is not the right moment to say it, and then left without saying it, which she filed as a conversation that would occur at a later date and would be worth having. Vecht paused and said, "The financial documentation review," and she said, "Will happen," and he nodded and left, which was the complete conversation they needed to have at this time. The chamber was empty except for Kaelin and 2 guards at the perimeter. He sat at the Emperor's chair. He had been in formal session posture for 3 hours, and she could see, in the quality of the way he was sitting now, that the session posture was done, and what was left was the man underneath it. Tired. Carrying something. The specific weight of a knight that had asked for more than knights are generally asked for and had received it. She sat down, not across from him. At the seat closest to his left, which was where a guest of honor would sit, close enough for conversation, not across the expanse of the table designed for formal confrontation. He looked at her. "The General," she said. "House Blackfen made him an offer 9 years ago," Kaelin said. "Before he came to my service. He took the position with the offer already in place. 9 years of waiting for the right moment." "Did he tell you that?" "He told me enough." He paused. "The rest Reth's team will reconstruct." She thought about 9 years. About the specific kind of patience that required, about the distinction between loyalty that was genuine and loyalty that was performed with sufficient skill that the difference became undetectable. This was the thing about trust that every ruler eventually encountered, and that no amount of experience fully immunized against. You built your understanding of a person through accumulated evidence, through actions over time, through the specific weight of moments where they could have made a different choice and did not. And then you discovered that the evidence had been curated, that the moments had been managed, that what you had taken as the measure of someone was in fact the measure of how well they understood what you needed to see. "You couldn't have known," she said. "That is not," he said carefully, "particularly comforting." "No," she said, "it's not. It's just true." He looked at her with the tired quality of someone who has been given an honest statement and is sitting with the specific discomfort of honest statements that cannot be made into something easier. "The garrison log," he said. "My mother is not who the document claimed." "I know. I am not who the document claimed. I know that too." She looked at the empty chamber. The session master's fallen ceremonial staff had been retrieved and placed against the wall near the entrance, and she could see it from where she sat, the mark of the morning's chaos. The physical evidence that formal process and sudden violence had occupied the same space within the same hour. "I want to go to Westfall," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She deserves to know," she said. "Whatever she was protecting me from, whatever the distance was about, she spent 22 years living inside that decision. She deserves to know that the thing she was afraid of was found and couldn't hold and has been taken apart in front of witnesses." "And you," he said. "What do you deserve to know?" She thought about the physician's log. 8 lines. The other woman's name. The almost match that had been close enough for a forger's purposes and wrong enough to matter. I deserve to know who my father was, she said, which is a different question than who the document claims he was. And it's a question only she can answer, if she chooses to. Kaylin said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll arrange an escort. I don't need an escort to Westfall. You are currently the subject of an active succession review process, a criminal conspiracy investigation, and the reason that a 20-year plot against the imperial throne was exposed in a single night, he said. You need an escort to Westfall. She looked at him. And when you come back, he said, we need to have a conversation that this morning did not permit. About what? About what happens to someone who has demonstrated that the quality of their observation and judgment under extreme conditions exceeds the quality of every titled official in this building. He held her gaze. And who has no current institutional position that reflects that? She thought about the preparation chamber. She thought about the archive. She thought about the holding suite window and the kitchen roof and the garrison log in the records office and the letter thrown across a council chamber. She thought about what it had cost to move through all of it and what it had changed and what could not be changed back. That conversation, she said, can wait until I've slept. Something happened in his face. Not the controlled quality, not the measuring expression. Something closer to the surface than those. Something that had the specific texture of a man who has been in the company of someone who tells him the truth without regard for what the truth costs her, and has found that experience rare enough to constitute its own category. Almost a smile, but older than that, more careful. Yes, he said. It can. Chomek. She slept for 6 hours in a room in the residential wing, not the holding suite, with a guard at the door that she understood was protection rather than containment, and she did not dream, which was either the body's mercy or its efficiency. And when she woke, the light through the narrow window had the quality of late afternoon in a city that was still working through what had happened inside its most central building in the last 24 hours. She lay still for a few minutes and she thought. This was something she had always done, use the first moments of waking to take inventory, not of tasks or plans, but of the internal landscape. What was there? What the night had moved, what she found was not what she expected. She had expected the weight of it, the accumulated hours, the near misses, the specific physical memory of a kitchen roof under her palms, and the specific emotional memory of a garrison log in the dim pre-dawn light. She had expected the exhaustion that follows sustained high-stakes operation to have settled into something heavy and requiring. Instead, she found something quieter. It was not peace. She was too honest to call it that. The general was in a cell somewhere in the inner security wing, and he would spend years in formal process, and the outcome of that process would be determined by institutional forces she would observe but not control. Malrek would contest every charge through legal architecture he had spent 2 decades constructing, and the contest would run longer than the night had, and would cost more than the night had, and would not resolve cleanly. The 12th face was in Reth's interview room, providing the kind of granular operational detail that would unravel financial conspiracies slowly and methodically in the way that legitimate dismantling always happens. Not in a single night, but over months and years of tedious, careful institutional work. House Blackfen would recalibrate. They would find the most defensible position available to them, and they would construct a version of their role in the previous night's events that emphasized the cavalry's withdrawal as evidence of their ultimate restraint. And some portion of the council would accept this framing, because some portion of the council always accepted whatever framing allowed the expensive work of full accountability to be avoided. These things would not resolve cleanly. What had resolved was the specific question she had refused to let go of in the moment when Vecht had offered her an easier path. The question of what was true. The succession claim was false. She knew this now, documented and authenticated, and entered into the council record in language that could not be subsequently revised without producing evidence of its own revision. She was not the daughter of the previous emperor. She was the daughter of a woman who had chosen distance over return for 22 years and had built a life inside that choice with the specific integrity of someone who understood that some decisions cannot be revisited without destroying the architecture you built after them. She would go to Westfall. She would ask the question only her mother could answer, and she would receive whatever answer came, the whole truth or the protected fragment of it, the complete story, or the version that had been determined survivable. And she would build forward from what she received, because this was what humans did with the inheritance of other humans' choices. You did not get to choose the foundation. You chose what you built on it. She got up. She went to the window. Valdorin in the late afternoon had the specific quality of a city that has survived something and is not yet certain how to describe it. She could see from the residential wing's elevation the broader geography of the palace exterior and the city beyond it, the streets with their movement, the market district visible in the middle distance, the eastern barracks whose cavalry had returned and were presumably occupying themselves with the administrative processing of an aborted deployment. Ordinary life running alongside extraordinary events, the way it always did. The laundress still washed linen. The baker still counted loaves. The guard who had taken a blade in the shoulder was in the physician's wing being told the details of his recovery by a man whose competence was in bodies rather than politics. And this conversation was perhaps the most honest one currently occurring in the entire palace. She dressed. She went to find the one person she had not yet spoken to since the morning session closed. She found Kaelin on the palace's outer observation terrace, which faced west and caught the late sun in the way that west-facing architecture catches late sun. Fully, without apology, the light coming in at the angle that made everything it touched look more significant than it perhaps was. He was alone. The guards were positioned at the terrace's entrance rather than beside him, which told her he had asked for the specific privacy of a man who needed to stand somewhere without being watched, and had the authority to arrange it. She came to stand beside him, not close enough to require acknowledgement, close enough that her presence was clear. He looked at her without turning fully. The peripheral acknowledgement of someone who had been aware of her approach long before she arrived and had decided to let it happen. Below them, the city. The eastern position, she said. The cavalry. Formally recalled by the Blackfen delegation at midday. Their lord's representative is cooperating with the investigation. Cooperating, she said. The legal definition of it, he said, which is to say that they are providing the minimum information required to be described as cooperative while retaining the maximum capacity to claim they were peripheral to the actual conspiracy. Will it hold? For some of it, he said. Not all. Reth's team is thorough. She looked at the city, the light on it. The ordinary movement of people who had gone to sleep last night in a city hosting an imperial summit, and had woken to something that would become, over the following weeks and months, a story that would be told with increasing elaboration and decreasing accuracy until the actual events were available only in the formal record and the memory of people who had been inside it. She had been inside it. That was strange to hold. The specific strangeness of having been present at a thing that would become historical. The knowledge that the version of events she carried was the most accurate version that would ever exist, and that accuracy was not the same thing as the version that would survive. The position, Kaelin said. She looked at him. Imperial High Chancellor, he said. The title currently exists, but the role was primarily ceremonial following the original charter's administrative reforms. It was never abolished, only diminished. It can be restored and redefined without requiring a new council vote. He paused. The redefined version would hold oversight authority over the financial management functions that Malrek's office held, with independent reporting to the Emperor and to the full council simultaneously, not to either exclusively. Bosta, she thought about this. That is a position designed specifically to prevent what just happened, she said. Yes. And you're offering it to the woman who prevented what just happened. I'm offering it, he said carefully, to the person who demonstrated the capacity to see a room's complete configuration while everyone else was seeing only their own part of it, to the person who refused to use a lie even when the lie was the easier tactical option, to the person who, when given every reason to run, did not run. He looked at her. Those are qualifications. The history of the night is evidence. The title is the institutional acknowledgement of the evidence. She stood with this for a moment. This was the thing about power offered rather than seized. It required a different kind of examination than power you had to fight for. Power you fought for had its own clarity. You knew why you wanted it because you had paid for it in specific coin, and the coin was visible. Power offered asked a different question, not whether you could hold it, but whether holding it was what you chose to choose. She thought about her mother, the laundress. 22 years of a decision made once and maintained through every subsequent day by the specific discipline of a woman who understood that living inside a choice meant not revisiting it every morning. She thought about 11 days in an invisible uniform, counting steps, memorizing routes, becoming furniture in a building she had not known she would ever have reason to call something more than temporary. She thought about the garrison log. 8 lines, another woman's name, the story that had been built on the wrong foundation and had collapsed the moment the original record was held up to the light. What would not collapse, she thought, was what had actually happened. What had actually happened was that she had caught 2 falling goblets and set them back in the wrong order, and then spent an entire night refusing to be anything other than precisely what she was. A woman who noticed everything and said it plainly and would not carry a lie even when carrying one would have made the next hour easier. That was not a title, but it was what the title, if she accepted it, would need to remain built on. It would require me to be here, she said. Yes, he said. To understand the financial architecture well enough to audit it. Yes. To build relationships with the Alpha Lords that are professional and not dependent on either of our positions being unchallenged. Yes. To be the person in a room who tells the Emperor things he does not want to hear, when those things are true. Kaelin looked at her. Especially that, he said. She looked at the city below them, the late light on it, the ordinary life of it, running its route alongside everything that had just occurred and would continue to occur. She thought about Westfall, about her mother, about the specific journey between here and there, and the conversation she would have when she arrived, and the answer she would receive or not receive, and the version of herself that would make the return journey after. I'll go to Westfall first, she said. Yes, he said. And when I come back, she said, I'll give you an answer. I know, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. This was the thing that had no formal name in the language of courts and councils and institutional positions. The specific quality of 2 people who have spent a crisis length of time in genuine proximity to each other and have discovered, without planning to, that what they know about each other is not the constructed knowledge of performed relationship, but the actual knowledge of people who have seen each other operate under conditions that remove all option of performance. She knew how he moved when the threat was physical. She knew how his voice changed when new information altered his map of a situation. She knew what it looked like when he made a decision on the far side of a cost he had fully accounted for, and she knew what it looked like when the cost was higher than accounting and he carried it forward anyway. He knew that she would not run when running was easier. He knew that she would ask the question that needed asking regardless of who it was aimed at. He knew that she had stood in the holding suite doorway with a garrison log under her arm and said, I need to know whether I'm telling the truth before I decide what to say, and had meant it and had acted on it. None of this was the material of formal titles or institutional relationships. All of it was the material of the kind of trust that is not given but assembled, piece by piece, in the specific circumstance of people who could not afford to be wrong about each other, and were not. There would be time for what that meant. Not tonight, not tomorrow. After Westfall, after the investigation's next phase, after the Alpha Lords had been sent home with their revised calculations, and the palace had settled into the specific reconfiguration of a power structure that has survived an attempt to destroy it, and is now integrating what the attempt revealed. There would be time. She turned from the terrace. She stopped. The servants, she said. The ones who were in the preparation chamber from the legitimate staff. They've been in holding since last night. Released this morning, he said, after the forensic interviews, full documentation of their service registry. Good, she said. She walked back toward the terrace entrance. Elara, he said. She stopped without turning. The questions you asked me last night, he said. The ones that were not appropriate to ask an emperor. She waited. Keep asking them, he said. She did not turn, but something settled in her chest. Not the cold that had arrived and departed through the night in the specific rhythm of a body registering threats, but something warmer and considerably more durable. Yes, she said. I will. She went through the terrace door and back into the palace, which was still the palace of Valdoran, but was not quite the same palace she had walked into 11 days ago. The roots were the same. The stone was the same. The smell of old paper from the archive corridor, the weight of cold air from the inner passages, the particular quality of torchlight on white marble in the residential wing, all of it the same. She was not. This was the thing that could not be undone and was not meant to be. You walked into a situation as one version of yourself, and you came out the other side as a version that the experience had made, and the making was not comfortable and was not clean and was not something you had controlled, but it was yours. Every choice inside it had been made by her, from her actual values, with full knowledge of what each choice cost. She had not carried the lie. She had not run when running was available. She had asked the question that needed asking and had received the answer that the question deserved. These things do not guarantee outcomes. The palace would have its months of investigation and its years of reconfiguration and its unresolved questions that would surface in unexpected forms at unexpected moments. Malrek would exercise whatever legal architecture remained available to him. The general would face his accounting, and it would be difficult to watch and necessary to see through. None of that was guaranteed to resolve into something she could call just without compromise. But the ground she stood on was solid in the way that matters. Not in the way of permanent security, which was an illusion no throne and no title could actually provide, but in the way of knowing what the ground was made of. She knew. She had held the original record in her hands. She had compared it to the constructed version. She had seen the difference. A true alpha, she thought, does not rule because the ground never shifts. A true alpha rules because she knows what she's standing on when it does. She walked toward the residential exit that would take her to the stable yard where an escort would be arranged for Westfall. And the late afternoon light followed her through the high windows in the specific way that light follows people who are moving towards something rather than away from something else. And the palace did not stop her, and the city waited, and the road to Westfall ran west through the low hills where her mother was carrying 22 years of a decision she had made alone. It was time to go be her daughter.